Welcome to New America and to our LEO Satellite Policy Forum. I am Michael Calabrese. I direct Wireless Future here at New America. And today's symposium represents the culmination of our nearly year-long process initiated jointly by New America and the International Center for Law and Economics, and in particular, Christian Stout, ICLE's Director of Innovation Policy, who will say hello in a minute. Since January, we've had a very diverse group of telecom and satellite experts, technologists, economists, and digital divide advocates participating in our LEO Policy Working Group that generated the report that we are formally releasing today. And there's, as I said earlier, there's QR codes for those in person. We have more people online, but there's a QR code take you directly to the report scattered around here, and an executive summary on the table outside. I want to personally thank our working group members for all the time and insights they've invested through dozens of meetings and in written contributions to the report, and especially a lot of editing and correcting, a distillation of which you'll hear from many of them on the 3 panels that will come shortly. As private companies and governments race to deploy tens of thousands more satellites into low Earth orbit, there is an urgent need for forward-looking policies. The working group focused on 3 fundamental pillars of the LEO Satellite Policy Challenge: access to spectrum to create far more capacity and coexistence, healthy competition in the satellite market, and bridging the digital divide with expanded connectivity and modernized subsidy programs. To start us off this morning, we'll hear about the FCC's very ambitious new agenda on space and satellite policy from Jay Schwartz, chief of the FCC's Space Bureau. My one beef with Jay is that he and the commission have moved ahead so rapidly this year with multiple proceedings on satellite spectrum policy that they beat us to the punch on several of our key recommendations, which I swear the working group identified these at a high level early this year, but it's so good to see we're in sync with the commission. And of course, we're just releasing the report now, which has all the great detail that they should certainly incorporate. Try to say that without having to file an ex parte. So I'd like to ask my co-conspirator, Christian Stout, ICLE's Director of Innovation Policy, to come up and introduce Jay Schwartz.
Thanks, Michael. I'd just like to briefly say also a thank you to our working group for the last year. It was a lot of work, a lot of meetings, and it really came together nicely, and we really appreciate all the work. Everybody should go read it now, please. Okay, so I'm very excited to introduce my friend Jay Schwartz. Jay recently rejoined the FCC as chief of the Space Bureau. Before rejoining the FCC, he served as vice president of public policy at Comcast, focusing on broadband policy. Previously at the FCC, he was wireline advisor to former chairman Ajit Pai and held positions within the Wireline Competition Bureau, Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the Office of Strategic Planning. Jay holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pittsburgh and an undergraduate degree in civil engineering from Texas A&M University. And he is now going to give us half an hour on his forward-looking agenda.
All right, thanks a lot. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I see a lot of friends in the audience. I had a lot of friends who contributed this report, and I'm a numbers guy, so it turns out I had to calculate that 71% of people who are named contributors to the report are actually people that I knew even before I got into space policy. And I think that's kind of remarkable because the fact that there's so many people who have been working in broadband, tech, telecom, are now working in space policy. And so if you needed a leading indicator of how booming an area this is, I think that's a pretty good one, that so many of us have found our way to space. So New America and ICLE are two organizations I've been long very familiar with. And often we hear that, telecom isn't all that of a political area. And I think your report, which has, two think tanks, frankly, coming in many ways from different directions, but coming together to discuss very seriously this important and emerging policy area, I think that continues that tradition. And so I really applaud you for that. I see both of these think tanks as oriented towards optimism about technology and figuring out how we can harness these really powerful technologies for the good of society. There is, in fact, a space doomerism contingent out there, I found. And I see this collaboration, fueled by optimism that I just mentioned, in pursuit of growth and abundance is just a really positive thing. So I applaud you for your report. I share that optimism, and I did read the entire report with great interest. By the way, this stuff that you put in the report, we thought of it like years ago, So don't think you can be like, oh, we thought of it. Yeah. So one things I like to do is I often like to look to history for inspiration. And I'd like to begin with a story from the Cold War. In 1948, during the Berlin airlift, West Berlin needed 5,000 tons delivered every day for the city to survive. But at the start of the airlift, the operation was only delivering about 20% of that amount. After a few months, a man by the name of Air Force Major General William Tunner, he overhauled the entire operation. Some of you may be familiar with this story. He figured out that, for instance, by creating one-way corridors into Berlin and requiring straight-in approaches, that the number of landings in the same amount of time could be increased from 9 to 30. He also realized that C-54s, which were much larger, could be unloaded within the same amount of time as the C-47s that they were initially using. And this was just because the sloped floors in the C-47s were much more difficult to unload. He also thought of things like ordering the crews. When you land in Berlin, you have to stay in the airplane. And then he sent jeeps out to deliver refreshments, because what he found out was happening is everybody would get out of the plane, they'd go use the restroom, they get refreshments, and then just that little bit of time, sucked out efficiency from the entire process and held things up. So you should actually go read. It's a really fascinating story. You can go read about all the changes that Tunner made. Those are just a few. And he explained this new process that he created as a conveyor belt. So a conveyor belt into Berlin. And if you know the rest of the story, with that conveyor belt, the airlift ultimately achieved its goal. It delivered 5,000 tons each and every day for well over a year. And they increased the throughput, the capacity, by 5x from where it started. So I told you I found this story inspiring. And I found it inspiring because it's a story of how, in many ways, mundane, seemingly minor improvements can dramatically increase throughput into a system. Now, I think it's really important at any particular time and in any particular policy area for those making the policy to have a clear vision for what needs to be done at that time and in that place. It's important to understand where in an industry cycle we are, and that's going to help guide us as we think about what are the most beneficial marginal policies that we need to enact. So where are we when it comes to the space cycle? My take is that we are living through the space industrial revolution. If you were to go look at a chart, and you can actually pull this chart up online, if you were to go and look at a chart from 1957 to today, and that chart would be plotting the number of things launched into space each year, what you would see is a long, pretty flat line, and then right around 2016, 2018, it goes vertical. It goes straight up. I call this the space hockey stick. I guess I've maybe coined that term, but it's akin to the graph you would see, remember I'm an economist, it's akin to the graph you would see if you plotted per GDP capita in Western Europe from the Middle Ages through modern day. Right around 1800, you see that hockey stick where it just goes straight up. So the graphs look very similar, and that's why I call it the space industrial revolution that I think we are living through. I could also show you a chart, for instance, of the licensing requests to the Space Bureau, and it would actually look very similar. There seems to be this rapid increase in productivity in the space domain that we are all seeing with our eyes every single day. We see numerous innovations, this rapid growth. There's sort of a demarcation, I think, in that graph between the new space era that we're in from that previous world of relatively slow, stable pace. There's things like standardized manufacturing of satellite buses, new materials being developed, novel space activities, D2D services that companies working on things even like data centers, which seems like in the last week, if you've been following, everybody started talking about in the last week. We see tons of startups, and similar to the Industrial Revolution, so much of this depends on the breakthroughs in falling launch costs, much like the Industrial Revolution benefited from steam power and machine tools. Now, there's also a twist, which I don't think necessarily tracks with the Industrial Revolution comparison, but it certainly makes the situation even more interesting and urgent. This isn't just a race that we are competing against ourselves for our personal best time. It's Space Race 2.0. The CCP is aggressively pursuing space dominance. They want to beat us to the orbits. They're developing new space warfare capabilities, and they want to offer nations around the world their own authoritarian-controlled internet from space. This urgency, the geopolitical one I just mentioned, and the promise of economic growth are what's driving our space agenda at the FCC. We as a country and as the Space Bureau need to figure out how we can get more throughput in the system. This is the time that we're in, and it's the key point that we need to meet in this cycle of space innovation. My point with the Berlin airlift story is that often by clearing out inefficiencies, we can see dramatic improvements in throughput. So what I'd like to do today is present a framework to organize my thinking about commercial space policy at the FCC. My framework is oriented around removing inefficiencies from the system, just like General Tunner. And I'm going to be thinking through 4 categories of inefficiencies that sort of are related or created even by the regulatory system. And we use this as kind of thinking about what needs to be done. Now, I'm an economist, as I mentioned, and so I think of inefficiencies as generating deadweight loss. Deadweight loss are those things that don't happen because of inefficiencies in the system, so we don't get services deployed, innovations that aren't ever created, affordable rural broadband not consumed. All these things are deadweight losses. They're good things that we want, and inefficiencies can prevent those. Today, the space industry, as I mentioned, is on a very steep part of the growth curve. The gains that can be had from going faster now and getting more innovation now are likely to be very high over the long run. Future innovations are built on previous innovations, to state the obvious, but that means there could be large ongoing benefits from more successes now. Early in an industry cycle, and I do think we are early, you want to put everything you can into getting more innovation as fast as possible, since the gains will pay off for the indefinite future. So consequently, we very much believe it's time to step on the gas. Now, let me also, for a moment, digress to point out a threat which I think we also must confront. Often when there are new transformational technologies and they begin to proliferate, others try to shut them down with regulations and red tape. My favorite historical example is the series of what are called the Locomotive Acts in the UK from the mid-1800s. These were meant to regulate the newfangled, self-propelled, steam-powered vehicles, which were called locomotives, but they weren't on tracks. They were on roadways and highways. And so they created the Locomotive Acts to regulate how they could operate on the highways. Of course, these locomotives were much better than the horse-drawn wagons, and so some people didn't like them. These acts put in place things like speed limits, 2 miles per hour in urban areas, 4 miles per hour in rural areas, and they famously required a man to walk in front of them waving a red flag. So these are called the red flag laws, more commonly than the Locomotive Acts. After a few years, common sense prevailed. They got rid of these laws. But my point and my warning is that so often regulations clothed in sensible sounding platitudes. They said you needed the red flag, by the way, to not scare the horses, by the steam-powered locomotives. So often clothed in these platitudes, it's simply the losers facing new technologies and trying to hurt everyone, holding back those technologies because they can't win market share in the marketplace. They want to compete in the lobby and not in the market. I think we are seeing this today in the space industry. I'm not going to name names, but operators and nations are trying to work the system domestically and through international bodies to slow down America in the space race. This is not the way. It's a foolish path, and we will reject that and respond to it at the FCC. Okay, now back to dealing with inefficiencies. Here are my 4 buckets of inefficiencies related to FCC regulation of commercial space. We'll go through technical inefficiencies, scarcity inefficiencies, economic inefficiencies, and bureaucratic inefficiencies. I'll try to make them distinct, but not surprisingly, there's a lot of overlap in many ways. Each of these, I think, are both created and solved by the policies that we choose. I'm not dealing with inefficiencies related to physics or finance or whatnot. As I often say, I am just a Washington paper pusher, and so I'm going to deal with the things that I can change and let other much smarter people figure out how to build satellites. So first, technical inefficiencies. Often licensees have access to spectrum, but they are restricted by the regulations or conditions on their licenses as to how they can operate. In general, these restrictions are intended to allow multiple operators to all use the same frequencies. That is, they're sharing the spectrum. There could be other commercial operators or federal operations that need protecting, and in order to do so, a licensee will have to follow certain limits, such as power limits or perhaps conditions placed on their licenses as part of federal coordination. Now, perhaps the most prominent, at least right now, of these limits are EPFD limits on fixed satellite service. These limits were set in the late 1990s and are a way to protect GSO satellites from interference by NGSO systems, or non-geostationary orbit systems. However, there is good reason to believe that these limits may be over-restrictive and that there could be a different approach which will still protect the GSOs but allow NGSOs to operate at much higher power levels. If that is the case, then these limits are creating substantial deadweight loss because NGSO systems are forced to unnecessarily operate at lower power levels and therefore are limited in the broadband quality that they can deliver to consumers. In fact, both of the major US LEO constellations that are delivering consumer broadband or anticipate doing so, they expect that if they can operate at higher power levels, they will be able to deliver fiber-like service, perhaps in excess of 1 gigabit per second. As someone who has worked in broadband policy for a long time, a lot of stuff with USF, a lot of stuff with rural deployment, the fact that we are on track to have 2 LEO constellations capable of fiber-like home broadband, in addition, by the way, to many terrestrial fiber builds that are probably going to be subsidized in many cases, this is a really unbelievable turn of events. I remember when I first joined the FCC in 2011, discussions were around, hey, can we get 4 megabits per second down? And then it was 10 megabits per second down, and then eventually 25 megabits per second down to rural areas. Now we're already seeing 200 megabits per second down available in rural areas. And as I said, gigabit speeds in view. There seems to be real benefit, both in terms of broadband quality delivered to rural America and, frankly, competition, right, between LEO systems and against terrestrial systems. Lots of benefits that we would be passing up if we didn't deal with some of these inefficiencies. Now, the good news is that the commission in April kicked off a proceeding on reviewing these EPFD limits. And of course, this is an issue tackled in your report. Let's talk about what I'm going to call scarcity inefficiencies. We want to be expanding America's capacity for space innovation. And one key piece of this is having all the inputs that are needed. If inputs to a system are artificially scarce, then this will create inefficiencies as operators must find workarounds, or in the worst case, won't even be able to deliver a service. When it comes to satellites, the physical inputs are spectrum and orbital real estate, of course. The FCC is the entity which manages the commercial spectrum, and so we are in the front in terms of making sure there's spectrum available for satellite services. To that end, in May of this year, we began a proceeding to look at allocating for space activities over 20,000 megahertz of spectrum across 4 different bands to be used for space-based services. One way to think about what we're trying to do here is that it's an attempt to remove inefficiency created by artificial scarcity, since it appears likely that many of these bands can very well be used by space systems, and we just have to make the change in terms of the allocation. As for orbital space, it's important that we do not create artificial scarcity either. We might do this explicitly by underestimating the physical carrying capacity for space and excessively restricting activity, or we might do so implicitly by not having some expectation for organized, coordinated behavior when you're flying up there. On that latter dimension, it would seem prudent to start building the systems for satellites to talk to one another to avoid collisions. At the FCC, we have an interest in this because avoiding collisions supports our statutory mandate to promote communications capabilities. And so with our recent licensing modernization in PRM, we proposed a light touch obligation to share ephemeris data. I think this is akin to cars having to put on their blinker when they change lanes. And if you think about it, you can get more cars to safely be on the road with a simple requirement like this. I'd also note this is the opposite of the red flag law approach, right? Because this is meant to expand the capacity for more activity, not to restrict it. So the point is we want to get rid of inefficiencies created by artificial scarcity. Next, I'll move to economic inefficiencies. Economic inefficiencies result from the regulatory framework, resulting from the regulatory framework may have a number of different forms. One would be misallocation. That's not having resources go to the highest and best uses. That is, there might be situations created where control of a resource, the ability to use a resource, is not in the hands of the entity that can be the most productive with it. And if that's the case, then it will impede us as a nation from winning Space Race 2.0. We want to make sure that we are as close to the production possibilities frontier as possible. There could be other economic inefficiencies created by the system. For instance, given the highly fragmented set of rights licensees have over spectrum, and the lawyers say I have to use air quotes around rights. But these fragmented set of rights and how operators must coordinate both domestically and internationally to use it, one might expect that there is what you would call an anti-commons problem. So an anti-commons problem is the opposite of the much more famous sibling, the commons problem, right? An anti-commons problem, instead of overuse of a shared resource, there's actually underuse of the resource because too many entities hold rights to exclude others from using it. I think if you think for a minute about the framework for space, you could recognize that this could be happening, and it's worth at least thinking about. I suspect there's probably a few other market failures, which I'm not going to go through, but misallocation and anti-common strike me as two that would be worth looking at. I think this is a particularly understudied area. Thus, I am pleased to see that there was some discussion of this in the report. One way you could start to address a misallocation problem, for instance, is by strengthening secondary markets. And on page 28, you talk a little bit about that. Lastly, let's turn to bureaucratic inefficiencies. This is certainly the one we at Space Bureau have focused the most on thus far. It's also the one your report really, frankly, pounds us for. I quote from, I don't have the page number, but the Part 25 satellite licensing process is complex, costly, lengthy, with the process taking anywhere from 1 to nearly 4 years. I told Kristen, I said, when I read that, I almost backed out. I said, I'm... To be the global leader for promoting growth of the commercial space industry and economy, we must modernize our licensing processes for space operations. Our licensing system is, I agree with your report, by the way. Our licensing system is rooted in a mother may I regulatory philosophy designed for the last space race. It's also unpredictable and slow. Obtaining an FCC license shouldn't be a multi-year odyssey. Engineers shouldn't have to guess what requirements the FCC ultimately is going to have for how you should design your system. Nobody should have to expect that the FCC license is the linchpin of their entire business plan. We think that it is urgent that we change course. Here's what we think modernization of our licensing process will look like. The Commission must make sure our rules are clear so applicants know where they can hit the strike zone. We want to establish envelopes of flexibility within which operators can painlessly adjust their operations. And we need to simplify processes to cut out the unnecessary. Eventually, we want all of this to lead to much more automation. More predictability, shorter timelines, less bureaucracy. In October, which was Space Month for those who are celebrating, right? In October, the FCC kicked off our licensing modernization proceeding. And in it, we proposed to get rid of that Part 25, which you guys panned. And we are proposing to replace it with an overhauled Part 100. The core of this approach is a presumed acceptable framework. The idea is that any licensing request which falls squarely within the rules will be presumed acceptable and expedited through the process. This means we only need to then focus on requests which seek to deviate from our rules. The current rules invite bespoke review of every aspect of a license application, and even the application materials themselves are organized to make it extremely difficult even for staff to figure out whether the request falls in the bounds of the rules. When I asked staff what they were spending their time on, so much of it was simply figuring out, does what the application says match up with our rules? It's insanity, and we are frankly proposing to change all of it. I'll also let you in on a little secret about our monetization proposal. We made, in many ways, very few changes to the substance of the application requirements, the actual standards that anyone's held to. But we tried to be very clear as to making it, but we tried to be very clever as to making the whole system much more efficient. In fact, we call it the licensing assembly line, which, remember General Tunner's conveyor belt. For instance, we organized the application materials to allow staff to automatically route and triage the requests. So we wanted to build that into the application materials so there wasn't this figuring out does this even match up with the requirements? We cleaned out a bunch of places where the existing rules require staff to make various decisions, and we proposed shot clocks at key points in the commission, so that the commission is kept accountable and applications know when to expect action. These are all, frankly, process changes in many ways, and I think very common sense. At the Space Bureau, we are dealing with several 100% increases in the applications compared with just a few years ago. And every one of those requests represents a ticket for some company to go deploy and build a system and innovate. When we delay issuing those tickets unnecessarily, just because of bureaucratic inefficiency, we are choking off the future. That's why the Space Bureau team has put considerable effort into fixing our processes, and I anticipate that will continue well into next year. This is the stage we are in with the cycle of space innovation, and throughput is so critical. That's why we're focusing on it. Thank you for your attention. I really, again, admire the thoughtfulness of your report. At Space Bureau, we are also working to dramatically improve the process in our little bit of the whole space ecosystem. And I think your report points the way on some very important points to do that. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I can take a few questions as long as you want me to.
Yeah, well, just, yeah, maybe one or two.
Oh, I ran over.
Yeah, which was much appreciated. But, yeah, just one or two, and then we'll. Yeah.
Okay, we'll do 2 questions.
Michael Nelson at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So I'm going to ask a geopolitical question. Countries don't like it when their people hear media they want to block, autocratic countries. What happens if some countries decide to start interfering and trying to block and jam these satellites, just like they've done so much to block Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia? And will you be involved in that discussion?
Sure, we can bundle. Yeah.
Get them both on the table.
I just want to ask when 6G is coming and countries block information anyway, like COVID lab origin. Everybody knows Peter Daszak and Ralph Barrick facilitated the transfer of IP to Wuhan. So they're gonna block information anyway.
I mean, look, it's they shouldn't do it. I think we are making the case. Yeah, I don't know if you're there could be a lot of different directions you're going with that. I mean, one of the cases we're making is why should a country choose to adopt a CCP system for their space communications when they've, in many cases, already adopted it for their terrestrial communications? And so I think we're in the lead right now in terms of having those systems up. And so we certainly say to other countries, hey, why would you want to go with CCP on both of them?
Be very specific. What if China starts trying to jam these signals?
We have an online audience.
What if China specifically tries to start jamming some of the signals and there's collateral damage? You know, other countries have interference and the service is not providing.
Yeah, look, I mean, there is an international framework to deal with that. There's also other ways to deal with that frankly don't involve the FCC that much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jay. So it is an ambitious agenda. I was right about that. So next up, we have Patricia Cooper, who is going to give us some LEO 101, since I'm sure many of you from our telecom world are not fully up to speed with this, rocketing, with these rocketing developments. So Patricia is the president and founder of Constellation Advisory, LLC, and she has very deep expertise in LEOs since she led government affairs at SpaceX during that company's startup years and later served as president of the Satellite Industry Association. Patricia?
Security. It's nice to see you all. Good morning. Thank you, Michael and Kristen, for including me in today's agenda, and nice to see you all. It's an honor to follow you, Jay. So Michael and Kristen asked me to give sort of a little primer on the satellite constellations, why we're seeing such a surge of interest in them, which, I mean, honestly, even for us satellite kids, has been an unexpectedly dynamic phenomenon. And Jay, I want to thank you for the work that you and your team at the FCC are doing. As someone who had a hand in some of the, I think I still might hold some of the records for applications at the FCC, although we'll see how they're going. It's really a pleasure to see the openness to rethinking processes and just how this wave should be overseen and enabled. So what I'll do is try to give you, particularly for those of you who aren't satellite aficionados, a little bit of a sense of what makes satellite constellations unique and frankly what good they are. And those of you who are satellite aficionados can check my map. So we're here today because over the past decade, there has been a significant excitement, investment, and deployment in satellite constellations, networks of many satellites encircling the Earth at altitudes that are close to the Earth's surface. That's the definition. Jay mentioned some of the numbers that capture the excitement. In 2015, when I started working on the Starlink system, there were just over 2,000 satellites total in all orbits, owned by all the countries, all the companies of the world combined. Just a decade later, there are more than 5 times as many on orbit and continuing to proliferate. We don't use the word explode. Admittedly, an outsized 10,000 or more of these new satellites are attributed to SpaceX's Starlink system, which started launching in 2019, and I had the pleasure to support. But constellation projects from Amazon's Kuiper, Eutelsat's OneWeb, Telesat's Lightspeed are deploying now. And government-backed projects from Europe's IRIS² and China's Guowang are next in line. The constellation craze is reflected by satellite filings at the International Telecom Union, which they list as being more than 1.7 million non-geostationary satellites registered. The largest filing to date, I believe, is a 300,000 satellite filing made from Rwanda. By any measure, this is an astonishing industrial trend that continues to be sustained by ongoing proposals from virtually every continent except Antarctica. So I will try to outline what makes LEO constellations different and the enablers and demand drivers, trying to harken back to my economic days, that make them worth pursuing. So with that in mind, let's dive in with some basic satellite constellations. The first slide, please. As I mentioned, low Earth orbiting satellites, LEOs, the constellations are by definition networks of largely similar spacecraft operating in concert and operating lower than 2,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Most of today's projects orbit between 500 and 1,200 kilometers. That's about 310 to 620 miles, roughly the distance of Washington, D.C. to Cleveland or Chicago. In contrast, the traditional geostationary satellites that have dominated the satellite sector for the past 50 years operate at 35,000 kilometers, 22,300 miles above the Earth. That is roughly the circumference of the entire Earth. In itself, that substantial difference in altitude can tell us a lot. First, satellites that are low to the Earth zip around the Earth quickly. For today's constellations, they go around the Earth in about an hour and a half. That means that you'd need many satellites following each other for a continuous service, which is really kind of what makes it sellable. In contrast, geosatellites are positioned so that they orbit at the exact same speed as the Earth's rotation, so that they can look at the same spot on the Earth all the time. So LEO satellites tend to be much cheaper and also much smaller than their GEO counterparts, which is good since you need so many of them. Maybe half a ton compared to many tons. And lower flying satellites expire sooner, lasting just maybe 5 to 10 years, compared to 15 to 20 years for GEO or more. So you'd need a dedicated satellite production line to manufacture so many satellites and lots of rocket launches to deploy them, both initially and then to replenish them as the network continues. This all goes to a completely different industrial complexity and project cost than what the space and satellite sectors had seen before. Not coincidentally, the rise of interest in constellations happens at a time when launching to space has become cheaper and more affordable than ever. Prevailing rocket launch costs, just fun to think about, are 20% cheaper per kilogram, which is the metric used, than they were in the space shuttle days. And just as a reminder, that they retired about 15 years ago in 2011. Costs to launch a satellite to LEO are more than 75% cheaper today than even a decade ago. And there are far more launches per year than ever, and more launch companies emerging around the world. Already, we've seen nearly 270 launches this year, it's only November, with just 85 launches in total globally in all of 2015, a decade ago. This is partly what's, put the FCC in a lot of pressure as you're licensing the spectrum for all those as well. Not just satellites, they do launch spectrum too. This is in large part due to the innovation of launch reusability. Instead of a single-use rocket that you launch and ditch it in the ocean afterwards, reusable rockets like SpaceX's Falcon 9 and others in the pipeline are designed to fly as many as 25 times each, helping both the cost and manifest schedules. So we're also seeing a difference in the spacecraft manufacturers and the diffusion of who builds a satellite. Not just the military industrial behemoths of before, but new, nimble, cost-conscious builders that can build a production line of thousands of satellites when those were never required before. And that also is leading to a trend towards in-house manufacturing for many of the constellations, allowing them to continually tweak and evolve. So there are a number of enablers that are making the prospect of satellite constellations more achievable than the past. But I mean, honestly, why bother? What are they good for? So next slide. The demand drivers. So I'll leave this graphic in place. It's from Bryce Tech, which is one of the best data sources on the satellite sector overall. And so they were kind enough to let me use this. This is from September 2025. Might already be out of date, frankly. So this is sort of a depiction of all the constellation proposals, their relative size, and whether they've been deployed or not, at least the major ones. There are obviously many, many more that are in the early stages of the pipeline. So what are the advantages? Being close to the Earth makes for great selfies. You can see constellations designated for Earth observation, remote sensing, and weather. There are lots and lots of those. Planet, Spire are two of the notable ones here on this slide. These companies collect hundreds of terabytes of data every day for enormously useful applications in agriculture, health, logistics, and national security. But we're going to set those aside for today because we're telecom people. For communications, being close to the Earth has a few benefits. First, they're always on and have worldwide coverage, since they're flying by the Earth every hour and a half. Satellites have always been, of all orbits, have been essential during emergencies and disasters, but now the services and their interface, the form factor, are more capable, affordable, and portable. Rural or thin route starts to have less meaning, since we're flying by anyway, adding the prospect of connecting far-flung villages or individual outposts without having to calculate the cost per mile of terrestrial deployment or digging a trench. Locations that terrestrial just can't reach, mountains, oceans, and the air, are now connectable with more comparable services. And this includes the North and the South Poles, if constellations are architected to do that, which is helpful for aviation, maritime, and national security. So flying close to the Earth also shortens the ping time to and from the satellites, allowing latencies as low as 20 to 30 milliseconds that can meet 5G standards of 50 milliseconds. This is in comparison to 250 to 600 milliseconds from GEO. Of course, lower latency has become far more valued in today's 5G world of streaming, gaming, video conferencing, and real-time communications. Overall, on-orbit capacity has also surged in tandem with the surge of the number of satellites, thanks to upgrades in onboard deployment, electronics and antennas, but also just the sheer size of modern constellations. Starlink, for example, has aspirations for 30,000 satellites or more. Amazon's initial Kuiper system is over 3,200 satellites. Other projects are in the high hundreds or thousands. As for on-orbit capacity, I've seen estimates of Starlink's total system capacity as upwards of 450 terabits per second. Amazon's Kuiper projected at about 117 terabits per second. I'm guessing both are, lowball or out of date. In contrast, an estimate from a few years ago put the entirety of the 400 GEO satellites on orbit at 2.7 terabits. I had to check to see that was a point. 2.7 terabits. Hugely different capability. On the ground, cheaper electronics have yielded satellite dishes that fit better in household budgets. Today's terminals are ranging in the low hundreds of dollars and are likely to drive even lower as Amazon and others enter the consumer satellite market and production numbers climb to scale. That's 10 times cheaper than traditional GEO satellite dishes, those you see on gas stations and office parks. As a result, the broadband offerings from satellite constellations are far faster, more capable than their GEO counterparts, and able to support far more users than satellite systems of the past. So Jay mentioned kind of the speeds in view. They're not quite fiber equivalent yet, maybe DSL equivalent, but their capabilities are now more comparable to terrestrial offerings and scaling. The report discusses at some length the services constellations are meant to deliver. For some, consumer broadband, others, enterprise, for government or national security. SpaceX's Starlink and Amazon Kuipers are the two constellations that are specifically focused on consumer broadband to address residential digital divide in the US and elsewhere, along with other services. And then, of course, for years, satellites have provided cellular backhaul, expanding the ambit of cellular networks. But just in the last year, we've seen a rise in proposals for satellite constellations to deliver direct-to-device proposals, extending the direct-to-the-handset cellular and mobile broadband capabilities. This would leverage the 5G-like latency that LEO satellite constellations boast and their global coverage to expand where mobile broadband services can reach. And as Jay mentioned, in just the last month, we've seen multiple plans to place data centers on orbit. I think the report provides a good look at what these various new service offerings via constellation might mean for competition, both with each other and with terrestrial services. But I would just add one final observation or caveat on constellation services. I personally don't believe we've seen the end of innovative applications that are going to get hung from these constellations, these massive infrastructures in space. We've seen, once you've mastered how to build the infrastructure in space, the ability to augment or morph your service offerings. Starlink has morphed from primarily residential broadband to enterprise to adding in-flight broadband and maritime and customized military, and then tailored direct-to-device and on-orbit data centers. I think we're going to see that kind of spectrum, not RF, that range continue to shift because good quality connectivity and the unique interests and demands of the previously unserved will no doubt bring some more surprises from constellations ahead. So before you all go out and start building and designing your own constellations, I wanted to close with a few caveats to put the extraordinary industrial changes into some different market context. You'll see in the report a number of constraints and complexities that constellations face that we'll discuss in the following panels. The limits in capacity itself, constraints in serving highly concentrated populations, spectrum availability that was originally optimized for GEOs or 5G, concerns about the market picture and competition as the field continues to evolve, and I would also add space operational concerns like on-orbit safety and the impact of the space ecosystem. So these evolving considerations are coupled with a super harsh gauntlet of financial, technical, manufacturing, operational, regulatory, and marketing challenges that mean that many of the plethora of satellite constellation proposals just won't make it. In fact, until this particular wave, every LEO project in the past has gone bankrupt at some point, and several projects from this wave have already folded. So it's a pretty fine art to predict what the constellation landscape will look like in 5 to 10 years, but the 1.7 million satellites filed with the ITU is definitely not it. Third slide. The next slide. So it's also worth remembering that satellites are a pretty small part of the global telecom picture, although we like to talk about them. According to the Satellite Industry Association, the entire satellite industry, including lots of non-communications revenues like launch and remote sensing, was about $293 billion in 2024. That's 77% of the space economy, which people at NASA sometimes forget. Communication satellites are really the big driver of space. But even those overly broad telecom stats confirm that the satellite market is barely 20% of the 1.1 trillion estimated global telecom industry. I just pulled this from PwC. There's a lot of debate about what these statistics would be. This one's from PwC. But this is even more starkly true in the narrower context of broadband. For example, I was so excited to see that Starlink had boasted that they had just surpassed 8 million subscribers globally over about 150 countries, which is a terrific accomplishment in just over 5 years. But, and all the world's GEO satellite broadband offerings never surpassed 1 million subs in total. Considering the 1.5 billion broadband subscribers estimated worldwide, satellite broadband remains a drop in the bucket at the moment. So, while satellite constellations are not likely to become a juggernaut that drives the telecom economy, their unique ability to close the digital divide and to extend good quality broadband in a variety of different kinds of applications to wherever we are makes us sit up and take notice. So perhaps their value isn't in amassing sub-numbers, but in who and where they can serve. That pesky final percent of the digital divide, the nation or world that's unserved, the 3 billion, and how that potential is valued around the world. One can nitpick the precise figures of what it would cost to close the digital divide with terrestrial technologies, but the estimates are substantial. In the US, I've seen estimates like 240 billion range, and worldwide 2.3 trillion. As constellations become more achievable and arguably more plentiful, those are motivating numbers to chase, which is no doubt one of the prompts behind the current wave of constellation proposals. So the report from New American ICLE comes just at the right time to explore the policy implications of constellations from a global connectivity perspective, from a spectrum allocation, and from licensing and competition priorities. This is part of a much broader discussion that's happening underway around the world. How best to enable and to oversee the growth of constellations going forward and their place in the connectivity agenda. So it'll be fun to see what the discussion yields today and onward in what seems to be a tremendous surge in satellite constellations, what it means for policy and connectivity objectives here in the US and globally. Thanks very much. You want to take questions or not?
No.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Patricia. Well, there was good stuff in there, even for the aficionados. That was terrific. So we'll go to our first panel on spectrum policy, and then have a short right after that. Immediately after that, a short break for those in the room to pick up lunch in the back and get settled again. We won't have any kind of long break because we have even more people online. But let's bring up our spectrum panel. I'm going to grab this first seat. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, they're working. Great. All right. Well, I have, of course, Jeff Carlisle, Armand Musi, and Joe Kane, and you can see their titles are clicked through to their bios on the event site. So first, I just want to start off with a quick, as I said in the very opening of the event, the working group report, shift this just a little. The working group report has 3 main chapters focusing on 3 key issues, right? Spectrum, access and coexistence, digital divide, and competition, healthy competition. So those are will be the three panels in that order. And I'll just take just a few minutes to kind of give a high-level summary of what the report found and concluded. You've heard some of that through Jay primarily, but the overall finding is that the rapid proliferation of more advanced LEO satellites, which Patricia just showed us quite dramatically, has the potential to enormously increase LEO capacity and connectivity from space, but LEO growth and performance is hamstrung by limited access to spectrum, constrained power levels, and much more cumbersome licensing and coordination requirements than are necessary, or even possible if we're going to keep up this pace of growth. The working group's primary recommendations on spectrum policy address each of these three challenges. First, the working group concluded that the LEO operators will need a substantial increase in spectrum access for both fixed and mobile satellite services. The working group generally supports the new allocations pending in the FCC's spectrum abundance proceeding, which proposes to expand the large shared bands that bring high capacity connectivity primarily to homes on the downlink, enterprises, and other fixed locations. In addition, we proposed the additional allocation of lower band mobile satellite spectrum to facilitate more robust direct-to-device or direct-to-cell D2D services, which I'm sure you'll be hearing more about. Second, the report endorses a new US-led framework for satellite spectrum sharing that allows higher power and more extensive spectrum access for LEOs and shared bands. This is consistent with the pending FCC proposal and with the US proposal at the 2023 World Radio Congress, which unfortunately was not adopted and was kicked for further study to 2027. And as Jay mentioned, the FCC is proposing to move forward unilaterally. Finally, the working group concluded that the current satellite licensing system is overly slow, bespoke, and burdensome. Case-by-case determinations can take years and lead to inconsistent conditions. The working group proposed a shift to more clear, uniform ex-ante rules with targeted enforcement as necessary. So, in essence, much as Jay said, this sort of presumptive acceptance if you stay within rules that need to be more clearly spelled out. We propose the FCC should adopt a shot clock that sets firm deadlines for application reviews and approvals. And we also proposed revamping deployment milestones to encourage steady progress and reduce speculative filings. One option would be much larger performance bonds that are incrementally refunded or forfeited based on the completion of these incremental deployment milestones. So that's starting to get maybe too much in the weeds. So we'll pull it back and get a discussion going. So I guess starting with spectrum abundance, the FCC's pending satellite spectrum abundance rulemaking could add 500 megahertz to both the 12 gigahertz KU downlink band and 500 megahertz in the lower 42 gigahertz. It asks about adding thousands more megahertz for uplinks higher in the millimeter wave. So start, I guess, with Jeff, who's immediately here, and anyone else who wants to pipe in. Is expanding these satellite bands needed now? And are these the best bands to repurpose from terrestrial use?
Yeah, I'd say yes on both counts. First, is it needed? I think the demand curve is there. You've not just for user links, although that's what a lot of people focus on. I think you also have to take into account that you increasingly need more spectrum for feeder links and gateways. Okay, you don't have a satellite broadband network without a lot of gateways. That's the only way it really works if you want to achieve the kind of speeds that you're talking about. So you need spectrum for more things than just user links. Aero Maritime, if anybody's tried to use satellite provided Wi-Fi on an airplane, which I do, it does work to an extent, but it could be a lot better. So I think ultimately, the demand curve is there. Whether or not it's going to be a smooth, increase of need over time or not is another question. But I think ultimately that's going to prove out the case that more spectrum is needed. Now, is this the right spectrum? Hard to pick in the near term better spectrum. It's adjacent to existing spectrum that's used for satellite. So it's much more efficient and provides you a lot more flexibility with what you're doing if you can just expand satellite use into those areas. So I'd say yes on both counts.
So I generally agree with that. I think the one qualification is that, or two qualifications. One is that we really don't know how many constellations will be up there and ultimately how many users there are. So it's really hard to quantify what the needs will be in 5 or 10 years. That's just really tough. The second is that whatever the FCC does, that's great. I mean, if they do the right thing, of course, but that's not enough. These constellations are global, and to justify them, they need to have customers around the world. And so we also need global harmonization of this new spectrum so that the operators can monetize customers around the world to be able to justify their global fleets.
Yeah, I think it's always good to get more spectrum into the marketplace for all commercial uses. I think it doesn't even have to be limited to satellite, especially as you're going into higher bands, something more like light licensing, where you can have lots of different people using it for whatever is the most productive use at that given time can be beneficial.
Okay, so kind of as a quick follow-up to this, what do you think about, it's asking general reactions to the fact that probably the most significant addition of spectrum in this abundance proposal, is the 500 megahertz being added to the LEO downlink in the upper 12, lower 13, and then in 42 gigahertz as well. So that 1,000 megahertz, they're being proposed as part of, is basically they're redirecting 2 ongoing proceedings that would have assigned, that spectrum for terrestrial use. The upper 12 gigahertz for mobile and the 42 for fixed, but now they're possibly, the proceeding is still in process, but possibly it's being shifted over. I don't know, any thoughts about, kind of putting that finer point on it? Because that's in terms of what it signals on the commission is doing or what's needed.
I mean, SpaceX is using KU band, and they are capacity constrained in many areas. So obviously, they would like more spectrum. My understanding is that they are actually more capacity constrained on the uplink as opposed to the downlink. But clearly, they could use that. Some of the other programs, such as Kuiper, are in Ka band, which is a little higher frequency. They should have better availability, at least for a while. SpaceX and others are, of course, for next generations, looking at higher frequencies, including 42 gigahertz and even higher. The whole trend in the satellite industry over time, when you go back, over the decades, is a slow march to higher and higher frequencies over time. And so over time, it will be necessary to go to higher and higher frequencies. And of course, the same is true with the terrestrial mobile frequencies as well. Remember, 20 years ago, even 2.5 gigahertz was considered very unattractive spectrum for terrestrial mobile. But over time, all of these communication services do move to higher frequencies, and it makes sense for the FCC to be looking at opening up higher frequencies to make them available as new technologies to exploit them become viable.
I think to add to that, I think you want the frequencies to be there before the technology needs them. I think we don't need to wait until we can say, oh, it's really needed now. We want it to have already be out there for people to use it.
Yeah, and I think to the question of sort of, is this a shift in thinking? Well, yes, I certainly hope so, and it's way past time. I think, in the last 15 years, the focus, perhaps not inappropriately, has been getting spectrum into the hands of mobile wireless carriers. And it has been deployed. And, so I think in terms of making the shift from a 3G network through 4G now, looking at a 6G network potentially, I think that's been, ultimately a success story, not without some bumps in the road, but it has, that's worked. I would frankly prefer the mobile wireless providers to, rather than get more spectrum that won't penetrate past glass in a skyscraper, I'd like them to focus on improving service quality today, right? That would be great. Let's make use of the spectrum you've got today, and then we'll give you more. Not to, cast aspersions, but that would be nice. But the real focus now, I think, I think if this is signaling a shift more towards, it's not everything's going to mobile wireless. It's we can look at specific bands and think about how they're used and how space integrates with terrestrial services, and we can make rational decisions as to how these resources are going to be meted out. That's a much better environment than where we've been before.
Yeah, just to add to that, this is kind of revolutionary where we are today. It's really the first time in history that two-way services via satellite are now viable at consumer price points. I mean, that's just never really happened until very, very recently. So this is really new that there are alternatives to terrestrial service, at least for some people.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also throw in, it's not all either or. I mean, there are sharing regimes that can be done, and you can also use spectrum indoors where, if you're using it out of doors for a satellite service. So there's in certain use cases. So there's, this is not a total, to say this is a throwover of the mobile wireless regime is not accurate. This is more of moving towards a more reasonable policy approach.
Yeah, definitely. And it's paving the way, I think, for probably more seamless connectivity on smartphones in particular. All right, so in tandem with its spectrum abundance proceeding, Jay described how there's another pending proceeding where the FCC has proposed to allow LEOs to increase their power levels in these same bands. So in these shared KU and KA downlink bands, which the LEO constellations share with mostly very high orbit, long-lived geosynchronous satellites that are operating high above them and circling the equator. But those satellites, which are really, in a sense, the incumbents, they've been around much longer and are much more long-lived in terms of how often they're replaced. They've had interference protection pretty strictly through the ITU. So the new interference metric that's been, sort of put out for comment would be based more on a proxy for actual harmful interference, and would also represent a sort of a unilateral adoption of the U.S. proposal at the WRC 2 years ago, which wasn't adopted, but it was punted for further study. So I guess I asked Joe first, and if you all want to chime in, is, what's really going on here? I mean, satellite policy like this is typically, harmonized globally. Countries typically wait around for the World Radio Conference. Is this simply a case of LEOs being primarily an American success story and the rest of the world circling the wagons, or are there really legitimate reasons, to keep the old EPFD interference levels?
Yeah, so I think the LEOs are definitely the new kids on the block, and for all spectrum policy, dealing with the incumbents is always difficult. But I think it's just reflecting the reality that for most of the history of the space economy, GEOs have been the space economy. That has been the entire game. And so the rules that we have now don't really envision a world in which we have thousands and thousands of satellites, especially low Earth satellites in multiple different constellations going around the Earth all the time. And so I think it makes sense to revisit those and say, what are ways that we can both adjust for this new reality and get more out of the spectrum that we've allocated? I think that it's important for all of spectrum policy to have the guiding principle be productivity of the spectrum, not just protection of whoever was there first, protecting their interference rights at all costs. Ronald Coase talks about it. It's not about minimizing interference; it's about maximizing output. That the optimal level of interference is not zero. And so, if there are ways that we can get a lot more out of low Earth orbit satellites by having a very tiny increase in the risk of a small amount of interference to geosatellites, that's worth it from a policy perspective. I also think there's a lot of ways in which you can increase the power without any additional risk to geosatellites. And so that's, there are both win-wins and big win with very slight loss.
So from everything I hear, the power levels can probably be increased safely. I actually moderated a panel exclusively on this topic 2 weeks ago at the Spectrum Americas conference. And one of the panelists, who's well known in the industry, actually had a different point that I think raises something to think about. And that is that if the low Earth orbit satellites increase their power enough, it may not interfere with the GEOs, but it'll actually make it hard to add additional LEO constellations. So he actually saw it as anti-competitive. I guess it's the wrong panel, it's the next panel. Anti-competitive because it would, yes, it would allow the LEOs to get more capacity from their, the existing LEOs to get more capacity from their networks, but may actually make it difficult to add additional LEO constellation. So I thought that was an interesting point that should probably be thought about as the rulemaking is considered.
With regard to the GEO issue, I don't see it so much as a LEO versus GEO issue as does the current regime kind of make sense anymore? And does it really reflect what we want spectrum or interference policy to be? So, not to overgeneralize, but, when you're talking about GEOs, you're talking about satellites that were, launched in the 80s and 90s, that are operating in the 2020s. There are more recent ones, of course, but based on a lot of engineering assumptions that were created in the 60s and 70s. And the reason those have persisted for so long is that there hasn't really been a reason to change them because the environment didn't demand it. Well, now we have a technology and constellations that promise significant additional service and functionality, more the output that you're talking about. And what they're bumping up against is what increasingly looks like arbitrary kind of power level limits, right? And one thing that gets lost in satellite world sometimes is the bedrock principle of FCC approach to harmful interference. Now everybody remembers the Hushaphone case of being the stupid little thing that attached to your phone, and AT&T said that'll harm the network. You can't use that, right? Well, when you had Hushaphone, when you had Carterphone, when you went into the Part 68 proceedings in the 1970s, the bedrock was, if you're going to have an interference standard, it has to be objective, measurable, and it has to line up with some sort of actual harm. You can't just say it's that number because we like that number, right? You actually have to line it up. Now, granted, GEOs provide really important services, emergency services, so on, and you need to have that capability there. So having everything be done on sort of a purely enforcement basis, a post hoc enforcement basis, may not be suitable for certain of those services. But I think there's certainly a lot of flexibility where we are to provide a more measurable measure, a more objective measure of harm that lines up with actual interference and provide a significant cushion for those services that makes sense. We just have to start asking those questions.
Okay. Well, let's move on to an even hotter topic, which is direct-to-device services and mobile satellite spectrum, which is in the lower frequencies, right? With better penetration. So very different than what we've mostly been talking about. Higher frequency, what Starlink, for example, uses to homes. This is to your smartphone, back and forth. So for the first time, a satellite operator, SpaceX, has agreed to buy 65 megahertz of spectrum from EchoStar for nearly $20 billion. And 40 megahertz of that is globally harmonized mobile satellite spectrum at 2 gigahertz that SpaceX describes as the anchor for a future direct-to-cell satellite service that can provide smartphones at least 3G capable mobile services anywhere in the continental US. So that means not just texting, as you can do now on Globalstar's mobile satellite service with the new iPhones. You can text from remote areas back and forth, but this would include, they say, texting, calling, at least light web browsing. So I'm going to ask Armand, why do you think SpaceX is willing to pay, and keeping in mind for you all that satellite spectrum is free globally. In fact, there's a law, the Orbit Act, that prohibits auctions of satellite spectrum here in the US. Why do you think SpaceX is willing to pay double-digit billions for mobile satellite spectrum that EchoStar and probably everyone believed was far more valuable for terrestrial 5G?
Okay, so that is a lot of money, right? It was 17 billion, 18 billion. But the real we have to look at is what they got. And that is something that is not 100% clear. So in the US, the 40 megahertz of MSS that you referred to is also co-primary to be used terrestrially. And so some portion of that SpaceX may use terrestrially, which has a potentially a much higher value. The other element of it is that that EchoStar has the right to that spectrum also in Europe with a complementary ground component. And those rights expire in 2027. I believe a lot of people thought that EchoStar would probably not get that renewed, but there's a belief that SpaceX thinks that they will get that renewed, so that they have similarly that spectrum in Europe that can be used both terrestrially and from the satellite. And they also have rights in Australia, I understand. And there's also there's an announcement from one SpaceX executive indicating that they had essentially perfected the rights globally. Now, I don't know exactly how they think that or what they think the exact path is to that. But if you actually get all of those rights globally, particularly if some of it can be bifurcated to be used terrestrially, perhaps with a partner, with a terrestrial partner, it's not a bad deal at all. It's actually a really good deal. But you did bring up another point, is that in most cases, spectrum is more valuable, at least in the market, to be used terrestrial for terrestrial mobile than it is for satellite. And historically, that's why most of the satellite spectrum has been allocated for satellite, to ensure that it's there for emergency use and other applications that you can't sort of measure in the market. But the market is changing, and satellite spectrum does appear to be more valuable today than in the past.
And there's very little mobile satellite spectrum in those low bands available right now, right?
Yes. Sorry, you made one other point about not selling spectrum. That's true. I think companies try to get around that by putting the spectrum rights into a special purpose vehicle, and then sell the shares to that special purpose vehicle to sort of kind of get around it. But
yeah, I think in general, this is another example of sort of the silos between terrestrial and satellite spectrum breaking down, that we have a more expansive view of flexible use. That used to just mean terrestrial flexible use or something, but now it's sort of like, it's not just T-Mobile and SpaceX. Like every major carrier has some partnership with some satellite company to sort of try to provide both. That we're seeing people think of companies now as sort of global ubiquitous connectivity companies, and not just sort of I'm going to provide this particular type of service. And I think you see that with supplemental coverage from space too, that the FCC has allowed. That there, what's the difference between that and an allocation that just says this is for either satellite or terrestrial? You figure it out, licensee, that kind of thing.
And I would say, whatever else you may say about Dish's efforts on the broadband front, I mean, they were extremely conscientious about making sure everything they were doing, they had a glide path through 3GPP as well. And so one of the immediate benefits of this is they don't really have to go through that process for this to be consistent with 3GPP. It's because of the work already done by Dish. So it's, so that in and of itself is valuable. And immediate, provide. It's a way of shortening the time frame to actually getting value out of the deployment.
Maybe one last point. This is the first time, as far as I know, that SpaceX has actually paid for spectrum, right? And it's a lot of money, and it's in lower band spectrum that's really only used for direct to handset or for terrestrial mobile. It sort of suggests that SpaceX really has some additional plans that perhaps we don't know about or maybe we can't appreciate yet. And it suggests there's something else maybe around the corner.
Yeah, that's what I actually suspect, and it will be really intriguing to keep an eye on that, because what's different about, you mentioned supplemental coverage from space, which is the authorization the FCC created last year so that, for example, Starlink can partner with T-Mobile, as it's doing, to use T-Mobile spectrum for some supplemental, so your handset can text outside of T-Mobile coverage areas. But this MSS spectrum, gives SpaceX a free hand. They're not limited by, what any mobile carrier thinks they should be doing, which could be, something disruptive. We'll see. So let's shift and get at least one more topic in, which is speaking of mobile carriers, something that they also, I think, this they probably will particularly oppose, although the NPRM was just adopted, last week, I think, or the week before. So this is the Earth station gateways that Jeff was emphasizing a few minutes ago, that as these LEOs proliferate, right, tens of thousands, you need more backhaul on the ground. You need to, get that traffic to and from the satellites and the internet. And so these Earth station gateways, they're under current rules in the millimeter wave bands, they're really difficult to license and cite, especially in the so-called UMFS bands, which stands, I don't even know what it stands, it's something mobile, but it's mobile frequency service. But these were basically 5,000 megahertz of millimeter wave, 24 gigahertz and above, that were auctioned as part of the Spectrum Frontier proceeding that had its first order in 2016. And these are all bands that are shared with satellite, but now, because mobile was prioritized and there was an auction and they paid some money, it's the satellite gateways are restricted to very remote areas and almost need the approval of the mobile carriers to coordinate in. So now if I could just ask, who do I want to ask about this? I think Jeff first, but you both know about this. I mean, is this a productive course correction? I mean, considering the propagation of millimeter wave and a lack of deployment, as it turns out, and that's what the NPRM says. Hey, they actually love mid-band. They're not deploying. Could simple database coordination facilitate rapid sighting and coexistence? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I know that, whenever anybody starts talking about databases, they get jumped on as, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Well, actually, it does work. There are literally hundreds of fixed wireless providers out there providing service in the CBRS bands right now that, it provides perfectly good broadband service, and it works very well in terms of the coordination that is capable through the systems. Has it been a totally obstacle-free implementation? No, but it does work. The concept does work, and I think we've now seen what not to do in terms of implementing those systems. So I think going forward, I think something like this, where there is really a valuable service that needs to be provided in order for these constellations to work, something like this really does cry out for sort of a next generation solution, like coordinated databases, in order to move forward with it. and active management.
So just to maybe back up slightly, the issue here was that this spectrum was acquired by the mobile carriers in the millimeter wave auctions. And I talked earlier about how the wireless industry is a slow move to higher frequencies. But in this case, the mobile carriers kind of jumped the gun and got spectrum in the millimeter wave, which it turns out they're not able to use very well. And the only real applications that it can potentially be used for realistically are like fixed broadband, fixed wireless access to homes, to businesses, things like that. And being able to combine that with satellite earth stations, which are also fixed, that should be really simple sharing. I mean, as sharing goes, that shouldn't be too hard. So I think that's very, very doable.
Very short.
And they're different angles, right? The earth station of the satellites can go up, and the fixed wireless to people's houses is going to go like across. So the beams really shouldn't cross too much, and the coordination should be far easier than other coordinations which have been successfully done.
And there's also a lot of experience on the fixed wireless side coordinating another spectrum bands based on exactly what you're talking about. It's not hard to do.
Yeah, I think it's worth revisiting. I just sort of worry about the FCC pulling the rug out from people who have paid for the spectrum under these licenses, and so I think there's ways that you could do it to enhance the productivity of this spectrum while also making whole or maintaining some kind of priority for the people who showed up and said, "Hey, we are willing to pay for this spectrum."
Even if you had to have exclusion zones around the satellite earth stations, they'd be very small because you're going essentially straight up. But I take your point that you don't want to shut people down who've paid for it.
Okay. Well, we don't want to crowd out the short pick up your lunch break, but so maybe we could probably take one or two questions if there are any right now for the panel on any of these spectrum issues. There's someone all the way in the back, I see. Yeah, please identify yourself too, because that's always helpful.
Hi, my name is Devon Jones. I'm curious specifically about the relationship between policy, spectrum availability, and spectrum acquisition, specifically as it applies to spectrum auctions. So I would love your thoughts on how we might, as an industry, do a little bit better about opening up the spectrum auction process to those outside the traditional players, and maybe provide additional benefits, a little bit more innovation, using a very complicated and sophisticated technology to people who might have some interesting new ideas about how to participate, but are otherwise barred by the process of acquiring the licenses, the rights, and maybe even the infrastructure to even access that technology.
Okay, actually, I have some thoughts on that. I think the easiest way to open up spectrum to maybe smaller companies or smaller entrepreneurs is to auction off spectrum in smaller license sizes so that the initial purchase price is lower and more affordable. I think we saw that in the CBRS auction. We had county-sized licenses. And you saw the participation of a lot of new faces. When I say new faces, new small companies. You saw a bunch of utilities. You saw some other companies that I never heard of. But I think that's the easiest way to make it accessible. That really applies to terrestrial mobile as opposed to satellite. When you get into satellite, especially with low Earth orbit, you're talking billions of dollars to get a constellation up there, and that's really hard to open up to the masses in terms of putting up their own satellites, at least.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that auctions are open to everyone. They're just open to the person who's willing to pay the most. And so it's not a bug. It's a feature to say if you're going to show up and willing to say, I'm going to give up this many resources in order to get the access to the spectrum, you're saying that you have a plan that's worth it. If you don't have a plan that's worth it and you're not bidding as much, then it's less likely that it's going to be worth it. I do think, to your point on the smaller license sizes, better secondary markets would help with that. If you can carve out pieces of a bigger license, that if you have something that, look, I have a really valuable use for this really small portion of the spectrum, you could carve that out and it would be worth it to the holder of the larger license as well.
But every time there's an auction proposed, you basically have the small carriers saying, let's have small license sizes, usually like CMAs or something. And then you have the larger carriers saying, let's have massive license sizes, so they're so big that only we can afford to bid for them. And that's sort of an ongoing debate, and really, every time an auction is set up.
Well, and if you open
But
up,
secondary auctions, secondary markets is helpful too. But if they're in small portions in the first place, that would make it easier.
and if you open up flexible use auctions to satellite operators, they will want nationwide license areas. Very hard to do county size satellite service. So that, yeah, it's tricky. Last chance for there's someone close up here, I think.
Hi, thank you. Josh Parker from Capstone. I kind of had on the note of auctions. I guess we have the upper C-band auction coming up, and I know it's been kind of hinted at that could be potentially purposed. Yes, of course, flexible use primarily for terrestrial, but also potentially sharing with Starlink, kind of lobbying essentially to get free sharing access on the back of that. Could we kind of go over maybe just like the feasibility of having a secondary allocation on that apart from the supplemental coverage from space framework? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I am not a technologist, so I don't know exactly how it would all work. I do think that there's some discussion I've heard of, depending on how big the guard band ends up being, that satellite spectrum is less likely to be interfering with the altimeters, and so you could have more in that area where, and how useful it is just depends on how big that has to be.
So if you're talking about having a satellite segment of the upper C-band toward the top of it, right where the guard band is.
I think that could be a way to do it. It didn't specify.
Okay, that might be doable just for the reasons that we discussed. However, I think co-sharing the frequency in the same geographical spot at the same time, that's going to be really tough with today's technology.
I mean, both the downlink fixed satellite and downlink mobile satellite sharing.
I think he's talking about C-band mobile, terrestrial, and satellite.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because there's two different things you could at the top, because not the entire upper C-band will be auctioned probably because of they need to protect these altimeters, the airplane safety gear that's in the adjacent band above. So one idea is to allow mobile satellite service to share whatever part of the band is left over for fixed satellite service. So you'd have mobile satellite and fixed satellite together in maybe it's 20, 40, 60 megahertz at the top. But an entirely different thing would be to have a supplemental coverage from space allocation across the entire mobile terrestrial part of the band that's auctioned from the get-go. It could be part of the auction perhaps, but that has other implications. All right, so we're set. Yeah, I think we need to break for the lunch. So, because we're already squeezing in, but luckily, or not, you're going to eat at your seats anyway. So let's take 10 minutes. For those online, you can take your break, go get your sandwich. But we're getting sandwiches in the back of the room. There's drinks, and bring them back in 10 minutes. So this is panel 2, which focused on the digital divide, which is, along with spectrum, another hot topic, in part because of the BEAD program and ongoing debates there. Moderating is my colleague Jessica Dine, who is a policy analyst for both Wireless Future and Open Technology Institute, and has played a major role, along with Sarah Forland, in leading this particular committee of the working group, subcommittee, and drafting the report. So I'll turn it over to Jess.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I'm Jessica Dine. Along with Sarah, I ran the digital divide subset of the work stream. And the title is pretty self-explanatory. Our goal was to figure out how and where LEO Satellite should fit into the broader connectivity toolkit. And what immediately became clear when we were looking at this was that choosing LEO Satellite versus any other broadband technology is a matter of making trade-offs. And so to make that choice intelligently, you need to understand those trade-offs, and you need to know when it's acceptable to make them and when it makes sense to make them. And so, of course, practically speaking, LEO Satellite especially residential LEO Satellite is a fairly nascent field. There is one active provider, another up and coming. Despite this, the US has taken a giant leap forward and is fairly heavily relying on LEO Satellite through the major BEAD program. And so it has become more important than ever to really understand the technology and understand how to make the most of it and ensure that consumers benefit. And LEO is a fantastically promising technology and has a lot of phenomenal use cases. It also has some limitations, some of which we have heard about today, some of which we will hear about. And there are also a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to using it. You know, in brief, LEO doesn't enjoy an unfettered capacity to scale. There are natural limits, there are population density limits, there are geographic constraints. Users need to retain a clear view of the sky. We've had an entire panel about the questions around spectrum access. And maybe most relevant to us, LEO's inclusion in broadband programs is incredibly new and untested. So our goal was to try to disentangle that and figure that out. In service of that, we came up with a few recommendations that should ease the process of incorporating LEO into our general broadband deployment and adoption strategy. And so I will run through them briefly, and then I'll turn it over to a conversation with our wonderful panelists who I'll introduce in a moment. Their names are also up behind me, on the screen behind me. So our recommendations were divided into short and long term. In the short term, we looked at the fact that LEO has already been incorporated into the biggest broadband deployment program today, BEAD, and we tried to look at where some of the pain points were. And one complicating factor when satellite participates in a deployment program is that, unlike, for example, a fiber build, there aren't any real build-outs to track or builds to watch out for. It's very difficult to ascertain whether milestones have been met unless you are looking at adoption metrics. Similarly, because many deployment programs have historically been geared towards terrestrial programs, terrestrial providers who have local deployments in discrete zones, there are many inefficiencies in the application process when LEO Satellite participates. And so as a group, we thought that these processes should be streamlined to better incorporate LEO participants, and the necessary reporting requirements should be determined and standardized. And those could include things like the projected uptake of the LEO provider, current and planned capacity, and things like that. But what's important is to figure all of that out ahead of time and to ensure that it's standardized across all programs. Similarly, deployment programs for terrestrial builds subsidize the deployment up until the point where the consumer plugs in their home router. So we think the same should be said for satellites version, which is consumer premises equipment. Consumer premises equipment, or CPE, represents a very high upfront cost for consumers. The installation can be difficult. And so our other short-term recommendation was that any deployment program include installation and subsidized CPE. And then we moved on to long-term recommendations, and I'll move through these quickly. Our first one is incredibly broad. We had a general sense that LEO connectivity should be used where appropriate as a broadband solution, rather than shoehorning it in every possible scenario, assessing its strengths and weaknesses and putting it where appropriate. We also thought that the FCC in particular should assess its potential in other sectors, and these sectors include D2D, backhaul, things like that, where it's making rapid gains. We also thought that LEO service should be eligible for any future deployment program. And the group did not take a stance on whether a deployment program should happen again in the future. But we did think that should one arise in the service of true tech neutrality and every technology being considered equally, it would absolutely be necessary for LEO satellite service to be eligible for it. Similarly, we thought that LEO satellite should be eligible for any future affordability program, and that such an affordability program is very necessary. Price is regularly cited as one of the major barriers to LEO in particular, but broadband adoption in general. And unfortunately, the US right now doesn't seem to have any real kind of affordability strategy as part of its overarching broadband strategy. And importantly there, affordability would need to ensure that the LEO service is affordable to the consumer. So for example, a $10 a month subsidy probably wouldn't cut it. And the final recommendation is a little bit distinct from the others. We thought that we'd need a new mapping process that better incorporates satellite coverage because the ones we rely on right now don't. And with that, I will move on to our panelists. And I will first introduce you in the order that you appear next to me. We have Nicole Turner-Lee, who's the director for the Center of Technology Innovation at Brookings. We have Mignon Clyburn, who's the principal at MLC Strategies, and Greg Geis, who's chief policy officer at the Vernonberg Group. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
And I'm going to start with one broad question, and Mignon, I'm going to direct it to you. You have a significant amount of regulatory experience in this area. And so looking at what we and everyone around us is trying to do, we're trying to fit a new and fairly unique technology into an existing and complicated regulatory broadband landscape. And so we've got two approaches to look at. When we're talking about BEAD, for example, which is kind of the flagship deployment program right now, the Biden administration took one approach. The Trump administration has swung all the way in the other direction. So could you maybe briefly comment on the differences between those two approaches, but then more broadly, just let us know what kinds of considerations do you think should be in play when we're trying to incorporate a new technology into an existing regulatory landscape?
So I'll answer your one of your questions first. Can I be brief? The answer is no. But there are three first for me here. First, thank you for having me. The second first, that I think it is extremely fitting that we're having these discussions about using USF proceeds to fund, these, operations, as this should be an opportunity, as always, for us to extend service across this country. That is the prime directive. But all of this will be a very wonderful reunion and academic exercise that will net, I believe, relatively short-term gains if we continue to refuse to fix the funding problem with USF. Honestly, this would have been months, I'm not going to say wasted, but, could have been, that requires a statutory fix, and if we don't address it, trust me, it'll be like opening and closing the government. But anyway, and I really don't mean it as a joke. It feels as serious for me as a former state, regulator and federal regulator. This would be a misstep, and so I've got more words that would go on for that. My first, it's imperative that we define the regulatory objective before the technology. What I mean by that is we should clarify what problem we're solving, not what technology we're excited about. It's easy to go after the, what's shiny, but it's important to remember, is the goal, or ask ourselves, is the goal universal broadband coverage? Is the goal resiliency and redundancy for critical infrastructure? Is it competition and affordability in underserved markets? This is how the policy sausage is made. So technologies like LEO fiber or fixed wireless, they're all means, not ends. And we need to constantly go back to that, to that when we talk about this. Secondly, we should build, I believe, a tiered technology readiness framework. Emerging technologies like LEO should pass through phased validation, pilot and performance validation or evaluation, scalability and sustainability analysis, consumer protections and continuity safeguards. Third, use outcome-based standards, not technology prescriptions. Going forward, it may be prudent to avoid locking programs into one architecture. Instead, use a performance matrix, minimum speed on affordability thresholds. Fourth, assess externalities and dependencies. We already talked about the unique, systems and the non-market impacts. I could go on, but I will move on to 5. Incorporate market structure and resilience. Regulators should always consider market concentration risk. You mentioned interoperability and open access to prevent vendor lock-in for anchor institutions or public programs, and of course, national security and data sovereignty. 6, use adaptive data-driven oversight oversight, set up that feedback loop. And lastly, I'll say, and it is not least, equity and the public value. Regulators should view new tech adoption through an equity and public good lens. Yes, I still use the word equity, will forever use the word equity. Who benefits first and who's left out? Are we reinforcing or narrowing the digital divide? Can deployment be tied to workforce development, local installation contracts, or community resilience goals? We've got to always remember the prime directive and we're our center of gravity. That is as brief as I could get. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. And we are going to touch on several of those points later on, particularly the outcomes-based processes. Now, I want to move to Nicole. I guess I'd like to ask you to do a little bit of stage setting for us. So our first long-term recommendation, and I think underlying the entire report, is the idea that LEO should be used where it's appropriate. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how to figure that out? Where is it appropriate? What do we need to do to figure that out?
No, thank you, Jessica. And thank you, Michael, Kristen, for leading this effort. Thank you to the People's Commissioner for always staying in the local lane of public interest, and for all of you. So I actually want to start by answering your question, Jessica, by detailing why there is a section in the report on LEO and the digital divide. And make sure, even though many of you who I know in this room have talked about this issue for more than 30 years, why it's still important to sort of tag this along the side of what LEO has the potential to do. I'll just do a shameless plug if you haven't picked up my book, but I know most of you have, Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. But this book was one that was sort of a labor of love as a person who started in this field 30 plus years ago. In fact, I knew Michael when he was actually pushing TV Spectrum. That's how far we go way back. White spaces, that's when he first started talking about it. At first he came to my office, I said, what are you talking about? And now, the FCC made a rule about it. But my point is, we're actually looking at this issue because across the country, we still have disparities when it comes to who's connected to the internet. And those disparities continue to persist in many respects, and I sort of offer this book, and I'll offer it to all of you. One, because we have not found the right solutions in the toolkit to bring broadband access to people in the way that is fitting for their experience, meaning urban, rural, older, younger, indigenous, non-indigenous. We haven't figured this out, that giving a wholesale solution of broadband connectivity is not going to close the digital divide. The other thing that we haven't figured out, and I think the commissioner touched upon this, is that we have not thought about the politics that go into how we swing the pendulum when it comes to digital access. So I will date myself. I've been dealing with the digital divide since President Clinton and Al Gore talked about the digital divide and affordable housing. Many of us know Larry Irving. I did too, as a researcher watching his work. My point is, for 30 years, we've seen different presidential regimes sort of prioritize the divide in some way, but aspects of it, whether from a supply or demand perspective. And we have seen this trajectory of the pendulum swinging when it comes to the type of technology being used. Some would say, when we first started this debate, more money went into programs. Over time, we got mobile technology out of the swinging pendulum. We've seen more investment in 5G infrastructure, et cetera. So I consider the LEO conversation to be part of this swinging pendulum, which is like a ping pong game of partisanship in many respects when we actually look at trying to solve this issue. The difference, though, today than 30 years ago in a society which has been increasingly digital and increasingly tethered to quality of life outcomes, are increasingly tethered to whether or not you have access. So what does that mean in terms of how we look at this strengths and the opportunities? Clearly, when I was doing my book and I was going into rural communities, the biggest thing that I saw outside of the house was a satellite dish. And I talk about that in the book. But many of you know that many people in rural communities, very, very rural communities, have satellite dishes because they have linear cable. It's not necessarily for broadband access. And so we do have, again, I think many people in many respects that are using satellite, but not for the purposes that we're talking about. With that being the case, we also know that there are affordability challenges. So on the opportunity side, again, if this is part of the toolkit that we've continuously seen historically, then we've made some progress, right? Because LEO does represent the latest in technology that we have not been able to offer before. On the challenge side, there are people that live in rural communities that do not have access simply because they cannot afford it. They can afford cable, potentially, but maybe they can't afford broadband. The other challenge that we have is topography, obviously. Many of those places that I visited, and being somebody who actually looked at the space area prior to LEOs becoming more popular, there is a lot of space junk, and the line of sight and interference actually creates challenges. That's a challenge. But on the opportunity side, it's easier to use a satellite to get to a very rural area. I call it in my book where there are more cows than people. And you don't have the investment to do the facility construction. So I think we can go back and forth in terms of what are the potential, short-term capacities that LEO could provide. But we have to continuously contextualize that in the broader challenges. We know, for example, and I'll just stop here, that we have a lot of homes when broadband first came out that were very excited to be online. But we also know midstream through the Biden administration that 23 million households lost connectivity because the Affordable Connectivity Program ended. And so we see this line item in people's budgets when we're trying to close the digital divide as one in which we have to be concerned about the income constraints, the extent to which the technology itself is going to serve. I think Mignon suggested it's what is the problem we're trying to solve? I think we need to ask that to consumer households as well when they're trying to consume broadband in the form of LEO or fiber or something else. And I think most importantly, that we think about, and I love the word that we use in the report, the toolkit, and how this actually finds its space among other technologies. Because what I've experienced over my 30 years of doing this, not one technology fixes all problems. And so how that toolkit looks, I think will better enable people to take advantage just of the opportunities. And maybe, and I know we're going to talk about this later, think of the challenges more as trade-offs as we're actually trying to see where this fits into the regulatory and the community landscape.
You've both made some great points so far. Thank you. And
It's good to follow the commissioner.
very easy to see that everything leads back to adoption. Even what is purportedly a deployment-centric program comes down to adoption. And I know one thing coloring everything we're doing here is that so far, this administration hasn't seemed as friendly to adoption. Using the BEAD program as an example, it's hard to see why we're saving money if we're not spending the savings on adoption. So that's something we can talk a little bit about later on in the panel. Right now, I'd like to turn back to the programmatic side of things. So right now, under the current BEAD program, which again, we're using as our main example of what a deployment program for a satellite could look like, NTIA is treating satellite commitments under BEAD differently than it is treating other technologies. And that is because the deployment structure of a satellite build is extremely different from a terrestrial technology. It's looking at things like reserving capacity for a period of time, free CPE, things like that. We're going to get to the adoption in a moment. But in the meantime, I'd like to talk about the fact that this approach differs from what's taken for terrestrial technologies. So in general, how should regulators incorporate LEO into programs that are normally designed for terrestrial technologies? Because local terrestrial networks have different pain points. And how can they do that and ensure that it's still a competitively neutral process? And Greg, I'll direct that to you first, and then anyone else who wants to take it can as well.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So I think the BEAD program was designed in its outset as a fiber-first program. So I think in some ways, BEAD is the right example, but it's also the wrong example because the intent of the design of the program was to try to get fiber as far as possible. And so that was the box as designed. LEO was then sort of grafted into a program that was not really designed for it. So I think that brings out the challenges in having satellite providers look at states and say, I want to serve these locations, and having to file multiple forms over multiple processes that are just redundancy in the system. And so it wasn't really designed to accommodate all technologies and how those might apply. But I do think, as we look at this, I think Commissioner Clyburn's point on what is the goal is the most important one. And so what we did know was that fiber is, as the report says, fiber is considered the gold standard. But fiber can't go everywhere. It simply can't. And to leave people behind because we can't get them fiber is to do them a disservice in a digital economy. So in designing these programs, we should right-size the opportunities to deliver the service to meet the consumer where they're at, right? And so if that means on an affordability program, we address that through a higher subsidy amount that's maybe tiered based on their income needs, but also on a deployment program. If we can't get it there, we need to figure out a way to get something there. And that's something, as I think the report points out in a number of ways. Look, this is a new technology. It has to be tested. It has to be proven, but it shows promise. It really does. And to say to people in these communities that are going to be reliant on LEO as the technology that you're getting something less than, I don't think is the right framing. This is what we can get you now. And the potential for upgrade is good, but there might be a potential to switch technology down the road. So I think as we think through these programs and we're trying to solve, the goal is really to allow people to seize full opportunity in a digital economy where education, healthcare outcomes, all of those things are greatly enhanced by access. And so I think that's the main point. I think the other considerations is, what is the upgradability of the technology? Sort of get more technical, like, can it be easily upgraded? Are there ways in which that will evolve over time? Does it look like there's a path to get people so that we're not stuck in these networks that were built? We kept paving the road over again in the past. Now we need to think about what's the technology that we can deploy so that that road receives minor upgrades instead of wholesale ripping out, right? And then I think the other thing is another point you pointed out, the resiliency and reliability of the network. Like, what is it? Is the network going to be available when consumers need it? Can it be turned on quickly when consumers go through a natural disaster? I think those are things that we want to factor in as we look at what technologies we allow into these programs. And then finally, the ability to deliver the service as promised. There is absolutely a need to collect data on whether or not the providers are delivering what they promise the consumer. That's been a problem across all technologies. The FCC has run a number of proceedings saying, we're not sure that the consumer is getting what they're paying for. And so having that rigorous reporting obligation, data collection obligation within these programs, I think will allay a lot of concerns, but also reveal to regulators where companies are falling short on their promises for delivery.
A couple of things both of you made me think about. We've got to recognize that sometimes old is new. And what I mean by that is sometimes a technology may be a complement and sometimes it might take the lead. In terms of regulation, we want this kind of free enterprise approach, but at the end of the day, who else is going to do the checks and balances? When it comes to ensuring that the public is getting what they pay for, their expectations are met, and the public getting what they pay for in this context works a couple of ways. Number one, you've got that little a love note that tells you how much you're going to pay into a system to support the universal service principles. And of course, you're going to write in, a check, which is more overt, every month or so, saying. So all of these things, we need to keep it. And this is not a smooth path. This is not a comfortable path. If it were, jolly and bright, we wouldn't be in this room. And so these are the types of things that we've got to know. And no one should be satisfied, but we do have to recognize that evolution has not only has winners and losers, but sometimes they have followers and those who leapfrog, and those are the types of things from a regulatory point of view that are the biggest challenge. We did embrace the fiber preference because that was from where we saw it, the quickest, most resilient, least dig multiple times, path for us to get there. Now in some ways it's we're approaching new days. And so what new conversations should we have?
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it's pretty clear that the market has dictated the fluidity of how we actually do adoption in this country, right? The market dictates whether or not the investment is going to meet the return based on where you build. The consumer consumption side of it is really important. And I think the resiliency of what customers expect. I would just like to add to the BEAD framework where I think we missed an opportunity, to tell you the truth, is by getting rid of the digital equity program, an aspect of the BEAD program, we also limited consumers' choice to be educated on what these actually mean, right? And so we have these tools that are coming out, and I think we're going to see a lot of consumers that will not be able to make a poignant choice on what actually works for them, simply because that it was a significant component, going back to my earlier conversation, it's in the book, this whole fight we've had between supply and demand in the US, and we constantly sort of see these separately, when really they're much more conjoined when it comes to whether or not we're going to see the type of market penetration and uptake as we expect to with any new technology reaching market.
So Jesse, I'm going to get on your nerve once again.
As long as it's not my nerve.
Yeah, no. It's sort of, again, I guess I'm a bottom line kind of gal. And so, I wrote down here, equal eligibility should not mean identical program design. That is not easy for a regulator, but it's a must. I will say, without taking a position or not, that LEOs, being incorporated in the in these affordability programs through performance-based inclusion, portable benefits, and structural recognition of unique, a cost profile. We need to take all of that in consideration. You talk about the CPEs and the like. It's not the same, price point. Should that whole evaluation matrix should be more neutral? I say yes. And it's not just limited to LEOs. Whatever Mignon comes up with next, if it's good, yes, I should be a part of consideration. Matrix. Forecasting my next journey. But in all seriousness, we're entering in a very inorganic evaluation regulatory space. And I caution all of us to put our patience hat on, because it's really going, to take that, pushing and pulling and yielding at times. And again, for DC and regulators, that's not natural, but it's the place, if we are truly committed to closing these gaps, that is where we have to, gain more muscle memory.
So this is what I'm trying to figure out. How should we treat LEO when we're incorporating it into programs alongside all of these other technologies? Like, what is the difference between tech neutrality and equality? The former we want, the latter is impossible. Technologies are different, and we have to acknowledge that, because like you started with, Mignon, the end result is what's important here. And to bring them all down to the same level, we're going to need to take different approaches. And so the example I'm thinking of right now is, not to go back to BEAD, but the fact that NTIA is right now allowing states to reimburse LEO providers on the basis of adoption metrics. And that is extremely different from every other provider participating in BEAD. And I've heard responses on both sides of that. I've absolutely heard some people say that that is unfair, and there are factors that go into adoption that are not in the control of the provider. So in general, and specifically about this reimbursement metric, how should we be approaching it to walk that line between equality and neutrality? Greg, I see you.
Yeah. Well, I think it is a good question, but I think if we think about, again, the point of what are we trying to solve for, which is getting people access. How could we compensate LEO other than an adoption metric, right? That is like to think that because we do it for one technology, we have to do it the same for another is limiting, right? And so I think to open it up and say, okay, what is a fair system of compensation for this entity to deliver what I'm asking them to deliver, so that as a society we can get the public good that we're looking for. Adoption is a good way for LEO. Otherwise, we're saying that are we going to use our deployment programs to build ground, their Earth stations, and to build the rocket launcher, and so it may be that that's not the perfect solution. But in thinking about this, I reflected back in 1999 when I was at the FCC, and mobile was still kind of coming in. And the USF program said, what can we do to encourage mobile deployment? And we said, why don't we adopt an identical support rule under USF? And CLEX and mobile guys can go build, and if they build into a rural area, they get the same support that the ILEC gets in that area. It took us about 4 years to figure out that's a problem. The dynamics aren't the same, the economics aren't the same, the change. So, but that's the cautionary tale if you just graft one system onto a new technology. And so I think what NTIA was trying to grapple with, under both the Biden and Trump administration, was how do we, if we're going to make this greater opportunity available for LEO, how do we account for them in the system without overcompensating them for the work that they were already planning to do? And over the years, USF has also been considered, should we voucherize USF completely, right? So that rural providers in these rural markets don't get paid to deploy the network, they get paid if they get a subscriber. And so those are, these are issues, and that has a lot of implications. I'm not arguing for that because it has a lot of implications around deployment, but these are the types of issues that we need to grapple with. And so I think compensating LEOs for adoption is probably at least a fair enough solution for now, and we can assess it as we go down the path.
So if I could jump in, I think it also depends on how we define adoption though, right? So we have seen the term adoption as we've talked about, and we saw this a little bit with the affordability of ACP, where we were trying to figure out, is it 1 per household, 2 per household, 3 per household? Adoption has changed to be, individualized to the consumer who's actually subscribing, and in some instances, it can be a point of connectivity for the community. Right. And so when you think about, for example, areas where LEO will be best served, you think about rural communities. I've had, we all have had the opportunity, some of us, to go to rural communities. Sometimes the fire station or the town hall is the point of adoption for many people, which can service a group of people versus a one household for whatever reason that might be, due to constraints of where they are within that topography. I went to Garrett County, Maryland, for example, where the topography outnumbers the number of people, the population that's there. Often takes 2 hours for people to get to certain spots. When you think about LEO, for me at least, is this a solution that actually does much more comprehensive coverage for communities in which you do not have the ability to deliver fiber, and more importantly, deliver a one-on-one solution to a family, right? So I think it goes back to putting programs into existing, fractured, outdated regulatory frameworks just do not work, right? And we do need to think creatively on how do you bring new technologies into the marketplace in ways that make sense for consumers, but also make sense for the type of competitive environment that we're building. For me, I worry that if we were to do a subsidy under USF, for example, under LEO, you're talking about installation costs, orbital station costs. You're talking about any type of, remediation that needs to happen. Those also get placed into the cost of service that people often pick up. And we saw this almost 10 years ago when we saw fiber deployed, and we found, for example, in Kansas City, 15 years ago when Google Fiber tried to actually deploy, people couldn't afford the $300 station to actually even participate in the program, even though the broadband was going to be $10 a month. Mm-hmm. So again, when we're looking at it on the public interest side, on closing the digital divide, all of these costs have to be taken into account. Mm-hmm. That doesn't also include customer service. I don't know about some of you, I used to have satellite and I lived in a very rural area in Illinois. Every time there was a wind storm, a rainstorm, a cloud in the sky. And this was years ago. It's gotten much better in terms of just the point-to-point and the managing the junk. My TV went out and I sat there for hours trying to figure out when it was going to come back on. Imagine, again, you do need all of those expenses covered. And so I think for all of us who are looking closely at the USF conversation, and we're including LEO, we need to think about what are these other variable costs that have to go into the affordability structure. The thing about fiber that I think most of us who have been doing this for 30 plus years can say is that the cost of broadband became a little bit more constant. Like we kind of know where it's expensive to build, where it's a little easy to build, where we can place it, where it's not going to have a lot of sunk costs, et cetera. Here, we're still trying to figure it out. And so I think that's what the commissioners talk about in sort of this nascent opportunity to, if I understood you correctly, to experience in the moment, but at the same time, be very mindful of how this will affect the current regulatory environment.
Maybe if I can just, because I think it's a really good point, and I think it builds on something that you had also said, which is under USF, we compensate the provider to deliver the service to the home at the network interface device, right? So they get paid for their cost associated with that. So like with LEO, if the install cost is to put this terminal on the side of the house, I think there's at least a comparison that could be drawn for compensation. And so I think we can look for how I think it's right. They're not perfect solutions, but there are ways that we can sort of mimic what that was. You know, we used to have under USF this linked up program, which went inside the house and helped consumers. So there are ways that we've done things in the past to try to ensure adoption.
Yeah, and I just want to push it if you don't mind, because that's why Michael invites me to these panels. I want to just put this out there. I think it's so important to, yes, stay with those modes. And I'm just thinking about my experience with white space technologies just recently when I went to visit Garrett County. It was wiring the school and the adjacent home and the small business, all within a small quarter block of this acreage of land. I mean, I think as we continue to have these conversations on USF, and I'm pretty vocal about that as well, I do think we need to also reconsider how we're looking at adoption. You know, I think the traditional ways in which we've actually had adoption defined by the customer base, it worked, but that's not how everyday people out of Washington, D.C. are experiencing broadband. And so I just think that that's something that we just need to continue to talk about. And you just had me think about some conversations I have with you on how do you actually begin to change the nature of how we define that.
You know, it's easy for us to sit up in this, you know, on 15th Street, thinking that everybody in America has the same portfolio as we do. Now, we want that. Those of us who care about people want that as a goal. The reality is it's not that way. So when you talk about it's so right for us to keep in mind that those what we used to call anchor institutions or you know places of commonality where people are comfortable and take pride in, even the post office in some instance, that is important for a robust you know by whatever means we can afford to provide to include you know, where we seated today, speaking about LEO, it is a must. You cannot discount that. I remember being asked when I was interim, is it more important for there to be connectivity on the road or connectivity, you know, on farmland? I want to eat and I want to drive. You're asking me, you know what I'm saying? I mean, you know, and to get that produce, you know, hopefully that's more efficiently enhanced by connectivity to, you know, the people, it's going to cost. So that or is a problem for me. At that time, I had to make a choice, but it can't be a permanent choice. I know you're probably getting it.
Well, we've got about 3 minutes, so I do want us to move on to audience Q&A. Yeah, we ate up the time. I think we've got a question.
Thank you so much. And obviously I'm on the next panel, but I know less about this panel. I'm really interested. It sounds to me as though the subsidies you're describing, Bede, go to the technology. And if Mignon, we're going to be tech neutral, is there something to be said about subsidies to the user? I don't know about that. And how do you guys feel about that concept?
So I answer it kind of inorganically to the user to make his or her own choice. Yes. To me, that's part of the neutrality equation. I'll leave with this. Equal eligibility should not mean equal assumptions of performance. It should be equal opportunity to prove performance and sustainability. And to me, that statement is wider. The choice in making sure that all of the choices we have are robust. And I'll yield to you first.
Well, I would just quickly say, yes, giving the user the money, that's an approach. I think as we recently heard, a solution maybe for our healthcare premiums was to give people money. I don't know that gets the effect that we want. I do think there are efficiencies because if the user is given the money directly to make the decision in their community, that's great. Okay, that is good. But if the community is not served and a provider is being enticed to go in there and serve, saying that you don't have the money to provide for deployment, but you can pick it up from users after you build, that's a different set of risk assumptions. And these networks get very expensive very quickly. And if we want LEO to dominate, then maybe that is the equation we would use. But I think if we want fiber and some of these other, the appropriate mix, we do want to keep a subsidy structure in place that actually supports providers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say on that, I was a huge fan early on in my career around agency of giving consumers the choice to be able to pick the provider that they would like to subsidize or work with. The challenge with the LEO market is I still think we need to do consumer education. I think people will not understand what that means in terms of what you're actually servicing. And when we say the word satellite, as I said, when I interview people, they thought of cable, right? Or they thought of television. So part of it is to sort of educate them that this actually can provide a broadband service in ways that meets their needs. I think the other challenge, though, of giving users a subsidy is that we take the eye off of the fact that we have to do general deployment across the country, right? And so I was a huge fan. I think when Secretary Davidson came in and said, we're doing all fiber, I think I was one of the first people who interviewed him and said, no, you got to do other technologies because other people connect in a different variety of ways. And the problem is if you give people the money, you sort of incentivize the market first, as has been said, without giving people the opportunity to get full build and consistency across their community overall.
Or is not the best conjunction here.
Right.
Or is not the
best. Yeah. You just have to figure out how do you grow the market while at the same time giving consumers agency over the choice of the service that will serve them best. And so we've made progress at the FCC allowing people to be able to get out of contracts. But we haven't made progress in terms of offering, the old country buffet model where you have a lot more that you can choose from to eat. It's the eat or drive model, right?
Okay. Well, I think we've officially come up on time, but thank you all so much for your insights. Please join me in thanking you.
I know, right?
Thank you, Digital Divide panel. So now it's can ask our third and final panel on competition to take the stage. Yes.
Whichever you want. I know you're.
Anyone.
Patricia, you'll fill in for Joe.
Let Scott interview his photo. As an audience member, you should be over here, Scott. You're Jerry.
Oh yeah, that'll match up a little better.
For audience, yes.
Okay, everyone. We probably should have built in more networking time, but we're running a few minutes behind, so we do want to get started with this panel on competition. And I'll turn it over to Christian Stout, who you met previously, Director of Innovation Policy at ICLE, New America's partner in this whole working group project.
Thank you, Michael. This is on, right? Yeah. So thank you to everyone. Good afternoon. Good news, we're the last panel. Everybody can go network and have coffee afterwards. Hopefully good news, this is about competition and antitrust, and everyone finds that as exciting as I do. So this discussion is anchored in our report chapter, which was titled Competition in LEO Satellite Markets, where what we wanted to do was explore potential competition issues that might be involved with the LEO markets. I just want to make a personal thanks to all the members of the working group again, and to all of our staff that helped us put this together over the last year. It was a real lift. And then one note, we had to call an audible at the last moment. Gerald, this is not Gerald. Gerald came down with laryngitis, and in order to avoid becoming a super spreader, he kindly stayed home. And Patricia kindly decided to step in and help us out. So I'm going to answer some of the questions too, and Patricia will fill in. So we're going to get through these questions. It'll be good. Okay, so the purpose of this report chapter, just to give you some sense of what we were trying to do, was to capture a moment in time of where the market is at right now with LEO, and with the idea of trying to imagine where competition dimensions might evolve going forward into the future, knowing that that is a fraught exercise because this is a very dynamic industry, as we've heard from Patricia in her opening remarks, from Jay and his remarks, from all of the panels. A lot of this is in flux. So what we're not trying to do with that chapter is make hard prognostications about where things are going or what the anti-competitive dimensions might necessarily be, but more to try to paint a picture of how, when in the future we want to think about competition dimensions among providers or in various ways, how we might frame those questions as they arise. So we had 4 lenses in the chapter that we structured this through. Structure of the market as it currently exists, entry into the market, how easy it is or difficult for new entrants to enter, differentiation of products across various dimensions. We've heard this from a variety of panels so far today that I think it might have been Patricia who said this, that we need to think about this infrastructure almost as a framework to hang services on. Right now, we know about it as LEO. We know about it as servicing somewhat poorly planes in motion, things like that. We don't know what these providers are going to do with their product markets once they actually have fully functional networks up and running and widely adopted. And then finally, the more speculative part of the chapter is trying to imagine for this particular unique market, what the conduct dimensions might be that would be relevant to regulators in the future when they're thinking about the firms in this market and how they might be behaving relative to each other. So we got a big picture snapshot from Tricia earlier. This is a very dynamic, growing industry. 2014, we had 1,000 or 2,000 satellites. 2024, we had something like 10,000 satellites. We have the promise of many more entering. One of the main takeaways from our report right now is that it would be far too early for anyone to even be bringing up any questions of competitive harm, which is something we wanted to stress when we were putting this together. Because a lot of times when people put together antitrust treatises, it's about competitive harm. This is a nascent industry. What we're really witnessing is the development of all of these, all the components in this industry. So right now, we're not really concerned about it. But that said, the positive message that we wanted to really capture, I think, in the way we wrote that chapter, is to say that we're witnessing competition for the market, not competition within the market necessarily. So we don't know which providers, how many providers need to be the dominant ones in order to make the industry stand up and actually start running. So we need to be very careful in the policy prescriptions that we have in this area when we're thinking about the competition dimensions. One other final point that I'll make before we get into our questions. Not only is this a nascent industry, but it's a complex landscape because there's geopolitical dimensions to this as well. Many countries, as we heard in previous panels, treat LEO satellite service as a national interest above and beyond market access or market services for their consumers and their citizens. We have nationally sponsored LEO networks around the world where we've heard concerns about from Jay and from others about the Chinese and how they are thinking about their LEOs as something that they can use to export Chinese telecom infrastructure around the world. So one of the competitive dynamics that will complicate any of these discussions is that there's going to be a healthy amount of industrial policy, unhealthy maybe, amount of industrial policy that we really need to consider when we're thinking about the different market analyses that we do in this area. Okay, so with all that in mind, one of the things that what we want to really come away with today with our discussion is what's changing, what's enduring, and how should policymakers decide what to do going forward. So Scott, I'd like to start with you. The report calls LEO a corporate graveyard turned commercial frontier. How difficult has it been for policy and regulation to move out of the 1960s framework that governed the first space age? Are we witnessing a normal shakeout phase or something entirely different?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, first of all. And I love that phrase, corporate graveyard, because some companies did try to do some of this LEO, these LEO constellations early on, and the technology just wasn't there, wasn't up to it. But for a long time, before the 1960s and on, space was sort of this very cozy relationship. The institutions were the same; they didn't change. It was the same basic technologies, sending up GEOs. And so on. But then Elon Musk came along and yanked the technology into the present. And so, policy stayed the same. So technology escaped the 1960s, but regulation didn't. And so now we have these fights over how to change and update the rules, which are still stuck more or less in the 60s. Jay talked a lot about the sort of reforms that he's thinking about. And one of the reasons that there's so much difficulty is that there are incumbents who want to block it. They don't like the new system. And the incumbents, the first thing you think of are the geos and the other satellites and some of the state countries that don't like it also. And that's a big part of it. But it's also the institutions themselves are the incumbents. The ITU is an incumbent. It doesn't like LEOs. The people who go to the ITU are the incumbents because they love traveling first class around the world and going to meeting after meeting. Yes, but I believe it's true.
Public choice is real.
I've been in many sessions and led many sessions where you start to talk about something different, that maybe there could be some kind of market-based system, and it is shut down immediately. Incumbents from all the groups that I'm talking about will say, no, that's impossible. We can't do it. It's too hard to coordinate across countries. We can't do it. Let's move on. Let's talk about the next meeting. And you think I'm exaggerating, and I'm not. And the thing that's amazing about it is that it's living through the exact parallel of the famous story of Ronald Coase at the FCC. In the 1950s, he proposed using auctions for spectrum. And he was laughed at. People said it was ridiculous, it was impossible, and just it would never happen. He was just fantasizing. And obviously we know that he turned out to be revolutionary. Now, that doesn't mean auctions will be revolutionary in space. Maybe auctions won't work. I don't know. Market-based doesn't have to mean auctions. But the point is, when people say it's impossible, it isn't. It just means they don't want to do it. But also not saying it's easy, because I don't know the answers. The obstacles that people raise are real. We do have to figure out how to solve those problems. But those, I think, are the things that are making it hard for the institutions to catch up with the technology.
I think that's a really great way to capture a lot of the optimism that Jay expressed in his opening speech as well, that what we need to do is look at competition as a future of possibilities in this space, no pun intended, that the presumptions that we had in the past don't necessarily hold into the future, and that we just need to have this sort of will to go forward and work on this stuff.
And I really didn't mean to be so negative about the people. I know people working really hard on this.
No, but it's a common problem. When you have bureaucratic inertia, it's not because it's bad people. It's because there's bureaucratic inertia. It's just the nature of all systems, corporate, government, and so forth. So I think it's a really useful observation. The report describes natural rather than artificial barriers to entry right now. But we've heard today that there actually are perhaps both natural and artificial. Jay highlighted them in his speech. What we want to discuss now is some of the challenges that are inherent to the physics and economics of space and some of the policy options. So some of these natural and artificial barriers that we identified, things like capital intensity. These are very expensive networks to stand up before you can even offer service. Launch capacity limits, how many vehicles are available to send up how much payload at a given time period, and the turnaround times. We have reusable rockets now, but even they are limited. We heard, 25 reuses? Yeah, so far, but it might have an end, so that they're not infinite. Also, one of the things I didn't hear today, but is also a very important component of this market, is very specialized labor. The knowledge that goes into the construction of not only the satellites, but all of the launch facilities. Those are not the kinds of things that you can just snap your fingers and suddenly have double the workforce that knows how to do all those things instantly. But then we also heard about policy mitigatable factors. Jay highlighted a lot of those, and he highlighted something that was really important. When our public policy is not in place in a way that facilitates market transactions or investment expectations, that you will see less capital actually flowing into those markets because the entrepreneurs and the investors don't understand what the return possibly could be. So as we solve some of these policy problems, you actually could mitigate some of these artificial barriers. So I've listed a few of those. We've heard some of those today. What are some of the policy options that maybe we have on the table that could get into these competition dimensions?
I mean, I think, I'm not sure how many of you know how the space law works, but a huge artificial barrier is SpaceX couldn't just launch their own constellation. They had to go to a government and ask the government to present the paperwork to the International Telecommunication Union that said, we have an operator back home who would like to use these frequencies at this orbit, right? So it's only a government under the Outer Space Treaty that is basically allowed to send objects into outer space. And that's an artificial barrier. It's an interesting idea. And I think that Musk tried to go directly to the ITU and went to a couple of different countries trying to find the best way forward. So that's a twist. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the physics of a constellation. If you're close enough to provide this great 4G quality, if you're in low Earth orbit, one satellite, as Patricia said, is insufficient because it quickly moves out of sight of you as its service area. So you need not just several satellites in a circle, but you need several circles. It looks like the lines of longitude around a globe, which means in order to have an effective service for any spot, you need an entire shell around the globe. And I can't think of any other technology that is inherently global. And I think that is so new to the world. But remember, one country announced to the ITU that it was going to do this global shell. So what do the other 192 do? What China said was, whoa, our people can't use an American system. And you can be sure that Americans won't be allowed to use Guowang. And the Europeans were like, oh God, we went through this with GPS. No way are we going to be dependent on either the Americans or the Chinese.
Right.
And what's going to be interesting to me, I think, is the entire continents of Africa and South America. So that's almost 100 countries. And they're kind of open to everybody. So who's going to serve Uganda and Brazil? Because remember, these constellations cost a minimum of 10 billion. A minimum. I think that's pretty much what OneWeb and SpaceX and Starlink have put into it. And Iris Squared, God knows how much they're going to put into it. But keep in mind, the Europeans and the Chinese are not doing it for a business proposition. So again, that's skewed.
Right.
They're going to do it for political reasons. They have to. It doesn't matter to them if they make a business case close. That's not a priority for them. So it's such a different market, to use Jay's air quotes, than other technologies and other products that I think we aren't even quite sure how to think about it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I would add a couple things. So if we're thinking about entry, your category on entry, there's clearly not a ton of barriers because we continue to see more LEO constellations being proposed. Every month, there are more LEO constellations being, maybe I'm on a different mailing list than you are, but I see them every month. You know, the Italian military wants to do one. Muon is doing one for wildfires. There are, Viasat's going to do a middle Earth orbit constellation. There are more and more constellations being conceived of and proposed, even through the regulatory process. That's where the 1.7 million non-geostationary satellites filed at the ITU comes from, through governments, but on behalf of companies. So we know that those, however stupid those rules are, or how complicated or antiquated or not structured for LEO they are, they're not the problem, nor is it the concept or the connection of that infrastructure with a purpose. But I will tell you, they are really hard to build. And that's where we're starting to see, you need a certain industrial capacity to be able to build several hundred satellites in a pivot for an industrial capability. Normally my voice carries pretty good. You need to have an industrial capability to build 1,000 satellites or several hundred satellites, where before that wasn't the size or shape or number you had before. And not just the satellites, but the pieces parts inside. The reaction wheels that tell it where to go. You need, 4 times 4,000 in a world where they used to build 40. So that industrial change is part of it. Getting the right people to build things, that has been a stumbling point for some of the constellations, to get a builder within the price points. And then a launch provider, we're at a period in time where the launch capability is awaiting new capacity, but it's slow to come online. So even though SpaceX has an overwhelming proportion of the world's satellite launches, and I'll pull up a number, there are more proposed rocket launch capabilities than ever before. It used to be 3 or 4 in the world. Now there are tens of them. But you know what's really hard? Building a rocket that doesn't blow up. And then once you do that, let's you get one that doesn't blow up. Then you have to do it repeatedly and in a way that engenders enough confidence that you will put your constellation on top. One of the best pictures I ever saw that depicts the launch industry is a super complicated schematic with a launch vehicle and a big cartoon bag of money on top of it. You've got to have, so those are the pieces that build it. And all that is a race for time to keep the costs low and also hit some of the artificial targets for build out that either the ITU or individual countries set, like the FCC's deployment milestones. So, you have to hit the ground running, building with the capability to build and deploy with a business plan that, someone's going to fund $10 billion or so, and at a pace that's going to get to the market with whatever you planned over the years that it takes to develop it, in particular applications where the applications morph so quickly. If the services are changing every 18 months and it takes you 5 years to build a system, what? No, you have that flexibility is the other aspect. Okay, those are mine.
But can I build on that? The verticality, I think, that SpaceX and Starlink have is only met by a nation state. And I don't know if we're going to jump to this, and I can't believe I'm a
We were
lawyer.
going to do it later, but we could do it now. Let's
Okay.
talk about vertical integration.
I'm a lawyer using an economic term, so I'm going to use it wrong. But the flexibility that Starlink has to adapt and update and change its design and improve things is only met by a nation state that has the same money, and maybe it's even better than a nation state. But most
I don't think
satellite
anyone have that flexibility.
most satellite companies have a structure where I have an idea and I'll pay you to make it and I'll pay you to launch it, and maybe I'm going to pay you to operate it. So if I want to change the design, okay, well, we're going to negotiate that for 6 or 7 months, and I'm going to pay for every single design change. Meanwhile, Starlink has changed their design 6 times. They launch something doesn't work, they improve it. So there's a flexibility that's not been seen in the space industry because of the money in the one company that can design it, build it, launch it, and operate it.
And I would say it's not just the money, it's also the mindset. I don't think the space industry has been considering, how do I tweak this? How am I going to iteratively improve this technology? Partly because, once it's up there, there's not a lot
They talk about generations.
Yeah.
And you change all 2,000 satellites, Gen 2.
The mindset is really not iterative. And that's why I think everyone looks at, a series of failed launch tests as catastrophic, whereas SpaceX views it as learning
Experiments,
opportunities. I got another 4 lined up. I'm just going through and testing the envelope. So that's a mindset, but also the capability of being able to go, down to the production line and say, this didn't work. Can you, tweak it? You can't do that when someone else is building it for you.
Right. So in this very early industry, very tumultuous, nascent industry, right now, the gains that we would be seeing for like a Starlink, they're really rewards for actually innovating on this frontier is a better way to characterize that, and at least for the foreseeable future.
I'm a little biased, but yeah, I think so. I think it's also going to be true for someone like Kuiper, Amazon's Kuiper is also building their own satellites.
Right.
So they have that same potential. Whether they have the same DNA about destructive innovation is a different question.
But then their innovation might come in other ways on the vertical stack. For instance, they have Amazon Prime.
Yeah.
If they find ways to
Application
reach consumers more directly, they're able to bring in these funds that help stand up the entire industry itself.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, but are there foreclosure risks that you foresee? I know we were talking about it before that we don't really see them right now, but like, are there foreclosure risks you would be concerned about on the vertical integration side?
What do you mean by foreclosure?
So like launch access or all the numbers I've seen suggest that Starlink is serving all comers on equal neutral terms. But
so it's not Starlink, it's SpaceX.
Or I'm sorry, SpaceX.
The question
SpaceX.
is, if SpaceX's rockets are dominant and their competitors, by the way, it's not an absence of competitors. It's that the 3 primary competitors to a heavy lift launch capability, which is enough to lift a satellite to GEO or 25 satellites as opposed to like 2.
Right.
That category has 3 big competitors. ULA, which is an alliance of Boeing and Lockheed, and had primarily served the US military. Arianespace, which is a pan-European project, and a new Amazon business, well, new, it started the same year SpaceX did, Blue Origin, and they have a heavy lift. All of those are new rocket vehicles, and they were struggling with the how do I build it, and how does it not blow up, and then how do I test it and build confidence? And I just looked at Space News. Jeff and I were just talking about Space News just did a little summary, at least on my newsletter, that goes through all the promises of where those rockets would be this year and where they aren't. And the delay and the complexity of building a rocket
That doesn't blow up.
and then can be in a cadence that you can deploy lots with confidence and schedule is the moment in time that we're at, because all of their competitors traded out for new vehicles and they're all struggling with getting them online. So 2 years from now, will SpaceX have the same dominance? Different question, because they'll be competing head to head. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But the fact is they are dominant now in the launch industry globally, and they are not behaving in a way that they could by declining to launch their satellite competitors. They're launching OneWeb. They've launched OneWeb. They've launched Kuiper. They've signed contracts for that. They're launching Telesat, the 3 major deploying constellations. So they're viewing those as different business lines. I'll get the stats, by the way. They're
And I think the Indian and Chinese are also, and God knows the Russians used to have the best in the world. So there could be other competitive vehicles depending on the politics.
Right.
Who's
but
allowed
now
to use
we're seeing
whose?
competition on the merits. It looks like these are gains from actually providing
Yeah.
a really positive service.
So this was about 2024, not 2025. SpaceX did 134 launches. Remember that in 2015, there were 87 total globally. The next two, China, 48, the whole country. Russia, the whole country, Roscosmos, 17 launches, compared to 134. And the next one is, and those are heavy lift, but most US-oriented companies aren't going to them for launch anymore. Sorry. And then Rocket Lab, which is smaller vehicles. Like you get down to Arianespace, which is one of the other competitors, 3 launches in 2024.
But as a policy person, I just have to say, regime change.
Yeah.
It happens overnight.
Right. Yeah, fair.
Overnight, an authoritarian government falls, and suddenly we're friends, and access to that technology will change.
Yeah. Wow.
A hard won story if you haven't looked up OneWeb and launching on Russia.
Oh, right.
Yeah, bad timing.
Overnight, yeah.
So,
but saved in part by launches by India and SpaceX.
And SpaceX, 100%. Yeah.
So as the industry evolves from a phase of rapid deployment toward more mature service markets, future competition analysis is going to need to account for demand side dynamics, how users adopt, switch, and value different satellite services. How should analysts and policymakers incorporate these demand factors when assessing competition in LEO markets rather than focusing solely on supply, capacity, or the number of constellations in orbit? Scott, why don't we start with you on that?
All right. Actually, just a couple of things first. I mean, Amazon Blue Origin, I think, would be much further along if Jeff Bezos hadn't focused on getting himself into space instead of other things.
His girlfriend,
his girlfriend, and Katy Perry.
Hey, right, and Katy
Let's
Perry.
not forget that.
Right.
But I think that really did set them back. Anyway, bringing up, I'm going to talk about demand in a second, but on the supply side, though, it will be interesting to think about what the effects of a constellation like Iris Squared, if it happens, and from other countries will be. Because for the first time, we're going to start thinking about competition in terms of not just American companies offering service, but what other companies could. I mean, why would we ever not want Americans to buy their broadband from a European company? I'm not even sure that we should bar them from, buying from a Chinese company. Maybe the military shouldn't, although, with the brain power we have in DoD, who knows what they're going to do. But so that'll be a whole other way of thinking about things. But one issue when we talk about competition, not just in this context, but at the FCC and generally, is that we focus almost exclusively on supply. How many providers do you have? What's the technology? What are the speeds that people get? What is the latency and so on? But, if anybody's taken an economics class, there's more than one line, right? There are two. There's demand. And when we think about competition, we want to know how people can actually substitute one for the other. And we want to understand something about cross elasticities. And we don't. We know very, very little about it. And if we're going to make intelligent decisions on any of the things we talked about, digital divide issues, BEAD, and so on, we need to know something about this. How much is LEO a competitor to fiber? Because for most people, it may be a perfect competitor. For some people, like a hospital, it may not be a competitor at all. And we need to know a lot more about that if we're really going to understand competition.
Yeah, that's fair.
I mean, I think at the hospital, absolutely, but everybody else is walking around with this.
Yeah.
They're not wired. And in fact, I don't think fiber is a player for most individuals anymore. And I don't care, me personally, not the satellite nerd in me, I don't care whether it's Wi-Fi or LEO or GEO, frankly, if GEO could do it, which it can't.
But as a satellite girl, it's so much cooler when it's a satellite one.
But so here's the thing, that's why D2D is so sexy, because I want one device and I want it to do everything, and I know it can, right? So give it to me. Use LEO, use GEO, use Wi-Fi, use point to multi-point, use whatever you need, backbone infrastructure provider, AST/Vodafone/ whoever you're going to merge with. Because figure it out, because I don't care. I just want to take this with me and have my 4G quality, if not 5G quality.
Right. People really don't care. Even at home, I think the word Wi-Fi has become synonymous with internet.
Just connection.
Connection.
Yeah.
They don't know that Wi-Fi is Wi-Fi.
You wanted to add something?
I was going to say, I want to caution everyone for the extrapolation of today's moment in time, because I think what's happening is LEO is being equated with Starlink, which is both the most visible and the most mature of the LEO constellations. OneWeb is out there, but is primarily serving enterprise and government, which are not publicly reportable figures. So we're not seeing whether Walmart is deliberating between OneWeb and Starlink in Uganda. We don't see that. I mean, some of our email lists see them, but we might see those evidence that business, either enterprise or government or other applications, in-flight broadband, for example, the biggest competitor to Starlink or Starlink's competitors are GEO satellites, not the NGSOs. And the same might be true for precision agriculture. They won that John Deere contract over Intelsat because the other NGSOs weren't doing or consumer broadband. The next offering that's going to change the way you think about LEO is going to be the Amazon Project Kuiper, which is both intending to do residential broadband and a whole host. Just think about the ecosystem of Amazon and what their Amazon marketplace might be as a target for who they're going to support and how they're going to affect our ability to see those head-to-head competitions. We're not seeing the head-to-head competitions with OneWeb because they're not publicly reportable.
Except on your private lists.
I see them. Yeah.
I think now we'll take
Not
some
private,
questions.
they're just
if anybody would like to ask our satellite girls and Guy some competition questions.
You can be an honorary satellite girl.
Come on in.
I'll be a satellite. We're all satellite
come
girls
on.
today.
That was our biggest
We have a
triumph.
question in the back.
Hi, yes, from the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So as I think about the way that things are going with the LEO network, we're looking at 2, maybe 3 networks coming up in the near future. Compared to if you look at terrestrial networks, you have 3 major cell phone companies. At broadband, you have a lot of regional pseudo monopolies. I'm wondering if there are any lessons to be learned for when the terrestrial market has worked out. We're looking at competition on LEO.
Sure. I'll start on that one because I think about that a lot. I think everybody's gonna be able to weigh in on this as well. When you look at the high fixed cost environment of even terrestrial network, it's not as much as a LEO necessarily. Maybe for the whole country it might be. I don't know. It's around there. But for regions, it's maybe not as much. Even terrestrially, the numbers that I've seen suggest that with this sort of industry, something like 2 to 4 competitors ends up being optimal depending on the area. And that's just in like one modality. That's when you're not counting cross competition from intermodal competition. So for instance, fixed wireless frequently is a very viable competitor to fiber in a lot of areas, depending on the geographical characteristics of the area. And increasingly in like dense areas, 5G service is going to be completely competitive with the fiber plus Wi-Fi or fixed wireless, things like that. So I would personally expect to see a similar dynamic when you're thinking about LEOs, where you're not going to see 15 competitors. You're going to see something like 2, 3, 4 will be where the industry shakes out in the long run.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to think a little bit differently about that. Instead of how many LEO constellations, think about the service. Because we could have 5 LEO constellations, 2 are taking selfies of the Earth, and 2 are providing enterprise and military, and 1 is doing residential broadband. That's a whole different question of how many is enough. It's not how many constellations are up there. It's whether the services that are hanging off of them and their terrestrial counterparts give you, the consumer or the enterprise or the government, the services you want and the competition and choices that you want.
Well, that's exactly what I was saying about demand, right? Because what matters is not the technology that's providing it, but how they actually, or how they can substitute for each other, how people consider them substitutes.
Yeah.
And just to pull in from our spectrum panel, spectrum doesn't respect political borders. So it's a technology, whether it's terrestrial or space-based, that's going to bleed over. And when you have this shell covering the entire globe, it's a different way of competing. And the satellites all share the same spectrum, which is why they don't get charged an auction fee, whereas the terrestrial mobile phone operators get an exclusive slice of the spectrum. It's only for their use. You don't know that necessarily because your phone is capable of receiving any of those service providers, but they've paid for exclusivity, and a satellite never gets exclusivity. And so that's something else to think about, why there are 3 in each nation. They've paid a lot of money, and they've got, that exclusive access, and that's not the way the satellite competition will work.
And I would just add too, these constellations are different than a lot of the terrestrial technologies you're thinking about, in that satellite's only going over the US every, it's going around 90 minutes. It's got other countries where you have the potential to serve and the business to do. And that mix of what those constellations are delivering, what they're valued for, what their utility is in that marketplace, I'm just going to shock you, could be completely different in another country.
Right, and sort of building on that too, another dynamic we'd have to think about is that we like markets. We want to think about how to have global markets. If we have a series of jurisdictions around the world that are creating all different kinds of regulatory overlays that you have to navigate, the artificial barriers we were talking about before might make it so that you can only have 1 or 2 providers that can successfully navigate all those jurisdictions to have a fully global system.
It is an art, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is an argument why satellites will say, well, we're just not going to provide, we're not going to offer service in your country.
Yeah.
Right.
I would just be careful about saying this is the way it is and it's the way it's always going to be.
Yeah.
We don't know how.
Of course.
Change.
And note too that all of these LEOs have a different physical architecture. No 2, Starlink isn't designed the same way. OneWeb, Kuiper, Lightspeed, Kepler, they're all different. We have no idea which one will be successful technologically, from a market base, financially.
From government relations.
All of these balls are being juggled at the same time right now.
I always like to think about the regulatory structure. If you're looking at a different country, some of the obstacles are going to be just, accidental. It's not like they're thinking in advance, gosh, what should I do in case someone brings a LEO constellation in KUKA band with it's going to be after the fact. So there's a certain amount of, lag in response to what new technologies are bringing. And then there are obstacles that are intentional. I want to protect my geo. I have different uses for this spectrum. There's a meaningful underlying public policy intention behind it. And maybe you can change that intention with a new utility or value, or just, by providing an opportunity. But then there are also those that I think are just by convention. This is the way it's always been done. So there is a lot of dynamism. I think COVID changed a lot. When I was at Starlink, COVID was a big pivot point because I would hear from countries, we've got like 75% connectivity. It's pretty good. We probably aren't going to need you. And then like a year later, I'd be like, holy crap, we've got 25% of our people who aren't connected. That's not going to work going into this next phase. So I think you can also have external events that change that underlying philosophy about how you view this and how much effort to put into rethinking the conventions, which is what we heard from the FCC. There's a point to it now.
Yeah.
Wanted to, unless somebody else is dying to go.
Well, let
me go. Yeah, just, and you can be short, I hope.
Yeah.
I just wanted to repeat a question that I asked on the Spectrum panel, and Ruth was getting at it a little bit. But we've been talking primarily about competition with respect to satellites competing with other satellites.
Yeah.
But when you see SpaceX, for example, just in September come out and pay $17 billion for EchoStar's mobile satellite spectrum, 25 by 25 megahertz, and now last week another 2.6 billion for 15 more megahertz. What is your? I know nobody knows for sure, but what is your kind of hunch or instinct about whether Musk has something disruptive in mind? Because I can imagine, some things that would, really get into the mobile terrestrial space.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think Musk has just decided he's going to use exclusive spectrum, and everyone else could go,
take a
they
hike.
may use shared spectrum, but he's not gonna.
Yeah.
And I think he's going to ignore whatever it's allocated for at the ITU and use it as he needs it. And good for him, frankly. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, but the mobile satellite allocation for these geostationary Inmarsat, who wants that anymore? No one. So if there's a low Earth orbit constellation that can offer a service, go ahead, use that spectrum.
Yeah, and I would say there's always a problem in letting go the service that it was allocated for that didn't work out. And how and when do you just call it? And I think that's a hard question.
Yeah.
And this is maybe one of the most abrupt and unexpected ways to get to that point. How do you get to good utility of that spectrum? We don't know whether that's going to be good utility. We don't know yet.
And 192 of the 193 countries didn't think of it.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm not sure
that's
the
a problem.
193rd country thought of it.
Well, but I mean, one of them got to register it at the ITU and the UN.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is a real problem, and it is its own barrier to entry.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a minute left. There was a hand in the back. Did you want to go real quick?
Just real quick, and it's a more general question than those that have been asked so far. One of the earlier topics of discussion was infrastructure development in the global south. And for me, that imports policy questions it imports a central policy question of what is the goal here? Is the goal utility? Is the goal return on investment? Is the goal accessibility? Is the goal performance? So again, a general question, as these technologies expand into the global south, what is y'all's sense of where the policy center of gravity lies?
What does the ITU or the UN call it? It's not just connectivity, but meaningful connectivity. Let's just say 4G. I think that, to me, that's the goal. Everybody on the world should have a 4G quality connection.
Or better.
Or better. But
If you
with
can do
4G, you can have what appears to be a real-time video call literally anywhere in the world, right? And remember, with the LEOs, you can now connect every spot. So the oceans, the skies, the dusty village in the middle of Libya, the island in the middle of nowhere, South Pacific, has the same quality of service as New York and Hong Kong. That is going to, talk about an industrial revolution. People aren't going to swim across the Mediterranean if they can find potable water and get an education back, in Liberia, right? People are going to change the way they immigrate, the way they educate, the way they work. We are only just beginning to realize and brainstorm about how anywhere, anytime, meaningful connectivity will change our world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think all the things that you mentioned have to go together. If you don't have utility, you don't have return on investment.
Right.
Which, I mean, like, if the whole point is to provide a service that's useful, that someone will pay for, and that you can continue delivering and theoretically innovating.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, it's not like these services are coming to the global south. I just saw Eutelsat OneWeb just did a deal in Angola, and I saw that SpaceX Starlink had signed 300,000 subscribers in Argentina last year. I mean, it's already there.
Yeah.
The question I think that's going to be really fun was related to what I brought out at the beginning. What will a user in, insert name of country that you want to think of as remote and underserved, think about differently now that they have that connectivity? It's a tool. What are you going to use it for differently? Are you going to use it for, connecting fisheries, or are you going to use it for to connect a bodegas that you can do financial transactions?
Right.
That's the next place where we're going to be surprised. There are going to be applications that come from different user environments.
Scott?
It's just, we know when people get electricity, the first thing they do is get a television.
Yeah.
So when they get connectivity, the first thing they can do is watch Friends.
Or cat videos.
So
Right.
cynical,
but
man.
But exactly, okay, that's going to generate more demand for all these other
Yeah.
great things.
No judgment.
Well, and one
No
of the
judgment.
things we've been thinking about in domestic policy in the United States increasingly over the last few years is now that we have AI and we're expecting a lot of AR augmentation to our workplaces, how is American society going to advance, and what is the infrastructure we need to support that? But if we have a global network that can do 4G, that brings a lot of that cutting edge capability to very remote people all throughout the world and brings them really forcefully into the global economy as forcefully as they would like. They can stay disconnected if they want, but it gives a lot of promise for economic development.
Right, and let's not forget that there are multiple, probably at least a national entity in between that service provision and the actual customer.
Yeah.
That there's a country that has to say, yes, it's important for us that this is available.
Yeah.
And permit it. So
I think we're pretty close to time here. We'll call it. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, thank you to the whole working group for this last year of effort. Really, really great.